point it skyward and hope for a reply. Her voice was precise, analytical, but beneath the surface, the weight of possibility stirred. If this intelligence communicates through electromagnetic phenomena, then perhaps that telescope is a transmitter as well as a receiver. Finch nodded thoughtfully, his gaze distant as he paced the length of the room, the worn floorboards creaking underfoot. Exactly, we could modulate a signal, something simple and repeated, a pulse, a pattern, something that says, "We acknowledge you, we are listening." Not a broadcast to the world, just a quiet conversation beneath the noise. His fingers absently traced the lapel of his jacket, a familiar, grounding gesture. It would have to be subtle, unobtrusive, but unmistakable. Reed's voice cut in, dry and pragmatic. And how do we get access? The MOD won't just hand over the keys to some mothballed telescope, especially not now. His eyes flicked toward the small radio on the desk, the faint static a reminder of the surveillance lurking beyond their walls. Will have to be ghosts, invisible. Jack smiled faintly, a glint of mischief in his eyes. Ghosts, huh? That's more my speed. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his bag, spilling a handful of small tools onto the table, wire cutters, scrapers, a compact torch. I know a guy who used to work on that site and might still have a way in if we move fast. His hands were steady, accustomed to the cold bite of salt air and the whispered secrets of sunken wrecks. Eleanor watched them all in turn, the weight of the moment settling like fog over the moor. If we do this, there's no turning back. The signal could change everything. Stir something ancient and inscrutable. Sterling's fears aren't paranoia, they're warnings. Her voice softened, almost a whisper, as if the walls themselves might betray her words. But we have no choice. Silence isn't an option anymore. The room seemed to inhale around them, the faint ticking of an old clock marking the passage of time with relentless precision. Finch stopped pacing and looked directly at Eleanor, his expression steady. Agreed, the moment for passive observation has passed. We engage on their terms, quietly, carefully, but decisively. Reed folded his arms, a slow nod punctuating the decision. We start with reconnaissance, assess the telescope's condition, its capabilities, then plan the signal. Nothing fancy, something primal, a heartbeat, a rhythm, something universal. He glanced toward the window where the moor stretched out, wild and indifferent under the pale sky. And we keep Sterling in the dark as long as possible. Jack gathered his tools with practiced efficiency. I'll make the calls, find the contacts, arrange the access. But we'll need supplies, extra batteries, portable generators, something to keep the old girl alive. He clapped Reed on the shoulder. Looks like we've got ourselves a project. Eleanor returned her gaze to the folder, fingertips brushing the paper as if it held a fragile lifeline. And the data. We'll need to monitor all electromagnetic activity in the area, build a pattern, find the signature of their presence so we can match our signal. Her voice was calm but focused, the analyst's precision sharpening the edges of possibility. It's technical, but doable if we trust each other. The soft scratch of a pen against notebook paper punctuated the silence as Eleanor began to sketch preliminary notes, frequencies, pulse durations, modulation types. The tapping was rhythmic, steady, a metronome marking the cadence of their unfolding plan. Finch observed in silence, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips, a rare break in his usual reserve. Outside, a cold wind swept over the moor, carrying the scent of earth and rain, stirring the dry grass like whispers from a forgotten time. The sky was a muted grey canvas, the promise of rain hanging heavy, but yet to fall. Inside, the small room brimmed with an intangible energy, a mixture of fear, hope, and the stubborn determination of those who choose to confront the unknown. Finch moved to the window, resting his palms against the cool glass, eyes tracing the horizon where sky met land in a delicate, trembling line. We're stepping into a domain older than history, something that sees beyond us. We speak now to avoid being silenced forever. His voice was low, almost reverent, the weight of generations pressing down with quiet gravity. Eleanor joined him at the window, their reflections merging briefly before separating again, two figures bound by shared purpose and fragile trust. Then let's make sure our signal is heard, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Her breath fogged the glass, a fleeting reminder of the human fragility behind their resolve. Reed stepped back, hands in pockets, a faint smirk breaking the surface of his usually guarded expression. Well, I never thought I'd be the part of a conversation with an ancient intelligence living under the sea. Life takes strange turns. His voice was light, but beneath it, a taut seriousness lingered. Jack gathered the maps and tools, slinging his bag over one shoulder. Then it settled. We move fast, move quiet. The quiet signal won't be silent for long. His footsteps echoed in the corridor, fading into the muted light of the waking day. The room fell into a contemplative hush, the calm before the coming storm. Outside, the moor stretched endlessly, the ancient earth holding its secrets, waiting for the first pulse, a heartbeat in the dark, a signal cast across time and tide. The quiet war had begun. Eleanor sat at the battered oak desk, the late afternoon light filtering through the grimy window of the APRO office. The smell of old paper mingled with the faint, ever-present hum of the ancient computer humming beneath her fingertips. Her notebook lay open, filled with detailed charts and scribbled notes, a pen tapping rhythmically against its cover as her mind traced patterns in the data. Each sighting report, handwritten logs, classified memos, and civilian accounts was a thread. She was searching for the loom. The room was quiet save for the soft click of keys and the occasional creak of the building settling with the evening breeze. Outside, the city's distant murmur softened against the pressing stillness of the fading light. Eleanor's eyes traced the columns of dates, locations, and descriptions, cross-referencing them against archived solar activity records she'd painstakingly acquired. Her breath fogged slightly as the temperature dropped. She drew her cardigan tighter, the wool rough but comforting. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then hesitated. The data was dense, multifaceted. She shifted in her chair, the leather worn and creaking as she leaned back, gazing up at the cracked ceiling tiles stained with age. Somewhere deep beneath the hum of the city, a faint buzz seemed to hang in the air, unseen currents she'd come to recognize as the subtle background of electromagnetic life. It was amidst this flux she sought clarity. Pulling a sheaf of printouts closer, Eleanor began to plot a timeline. Major sightings of the larger triangular craft, those rare and unsettling moments when something undeniably otherworldly had cut through the night sky, clustered peculiarly. They didn't scatter randomly across years. They pulsed in time to something ancient and vast. She overlaid solar flare activity charts from the same periods, aligning dates with the sudden bursts of charged particles and coronal mass ejections irradiating the sun's surface. Her pen's tapping slowed and then stopped. The correlation was undeniable. Each significant appearance coincided with intense solar events, periods when the sun spat forth its fury in waves that rippled through Earth's magnetosphere. A pattern emerged out of the chaos, moments when the ancient intelligence seemed to awaken, stirring in resonance with the stars' violent breath. Eleanor's heartbeat slowed to match the tranquil rhythm she imagined in those distant solar storms. She spread the printouts across the desk, plotting the amplitude of solar flares against the timing of sightings. The idea that this terrestrial, deep ocean intelligence might be responding to the sun's mood, an unfathomable celestial dance, both terrified and fascinated her. The soft scent of brewing tea drifted across the room as Finch entered, his corduroy jacket trailing a faint mustiness of old earth and libraries. He regarded her spread of papers with a steady, contemplative gaze. "You found something," he said softly, the timbre of his voice carrying years of restrained excitement. Eleanor nodded. "The big sightings, they align with solar flare peaks. It's like they're waiting or triggered by these events. I'm building a model to predict the next window." Finch settled into the chair opposite, folding his hands on the table. "And the model?" "Preliminary, but it points to a major solar event in roughly 3 weeks' time, the kind of storm that would send the magnetosphere into turmoil." She tapped a cluster of dates on the page. "If we're right, that's when we might expect the next contact, or at least the conditions that make the probe signals stronger, more coherent." A faint smile touched Finch's lips, wry and subdued. "Then our silence won't hold for long?" Outside, the sky deepened into a bruised twilight. The first stars blinked awake, fragile and distant. Eleanor's gaze lifted toward them, thoughtful, the sun's violent whisper, the deep ocean's patient watchfulness, and now the ancient intelligence poised on the edge of human understanding. Everything converged in the quiet intervals between moments. Back at the workstation, Eleanor pulled up satellite data capturing solar wind streams and geomagnetic indices. The graphs rippled with familiar undulations, the sun's breath measured in predictable tempests. She overlaid her model's projections, watching the lines converge toward a sharp peak, an invisible pulse gathering in the cosmic tide. The gentle tap of footsteps announced Reed's arrival. He stood by the door, his uniform replaced by plain clothes, though the rigid posture and sharp gaze remained. He surveyed the data with a pragmatic eye, brushing a hand through his dark hair as he absorbed the implications. "So, the when is set," he murmured, voice low, almost reluctant. 3 weeks. Enough time to prepare, but not much." "Exactly," Eleanor replied. "We need to be ready to react. The telescope, the signal, it has to be precise. We can't afford to startle it." Reed nodded almost imperceptibly. "And what about Sterling? He'll smell this from miles off." Finch's expression tightened slightly, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the desk. "We keep this quiet, at least until we have proof. No leaks, no unnecessary alarm." Jack's rough voice came from the doorway, breaking the tense stillness. "I've got contacts near the site. Could get us in without raising flags. But we'll need to move carefully. Sterling's men are watching." The group acknowledged the gravity of the moment. Eleanor returned to her screen, scrolling through the historical data once more. Smaller, less conspicuous sightings, dots of light, brief flashes, also showed subtle correlations with minor solar events. The intelligence's probes didn't just respond to the biggest flares, they appeared attuned to a spectrum of solar moods. As night deepened, Eleanor leaned back, eyes closing briefly. The slow, steady tap of her pen resumed, a metronome echoing the rhythm of a heartbeat she was only beginning to comprehend. The solar storm, the signal, the ancient watchers beneath the waves, all were threads in a silent cosmic conversation. In the dim light of the room, the data points shimmered faintly on the screen, like distant stars waiting to be reached. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the telescope in the Peak District, its great dish dormant but listening, a sentinel at the edge of human knowledge. Soon it would awaken. The scent of rain on stone wafted through the cracked window as the chill settled over the office. Outside, the city's murmur softened into a night lullaby. Eleanor reopened her eyes, determination steadying her breath. The quiet signal was almost within reach. She turned to Finch, voice low but firm. "This is our moment. The sun's storm will give us a window. We craft the pulse, simple, deliberate, and send it into the void. Let's hope the silence answers back." Finch nodded, the faintest smile touching his lips. A heartbeat, quiet, patient, exactly as it should be. The team gathered their things, each lost in the weight of what lay ahead. The future was a fragile thread woven from ancient light and deep-sea shadows. Eleanor lingered a moment longer, fingers tracing the cool surface of the desk, feeling the pulse of a world waiting to speak. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, a steady rhythm on the window pane. The quiet signal was poised to pierce the silence. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the rolling hills beyond the modest window of the APRO office. Eleanor had already left for the data center, and the quiet hum of the ancient fluorescent tubes overhead was the only sign of life in the cramped room. Finch sat at his desk, absent-mindedly fingering the frayed cuff of his corduroy jacket as he leafed through a tattered map of the Peak District. The faint scent of damp paper and cold metal filled the air, mingling with the distant rumble of London traffic. Outside, a thin drizzle began to fall, the soft pattering sharp against the window pane. Thomas Reed stood by the dusty radiator, staring at a worn notebook spread open across Finch's desk. The scent of the rain seeping into the building brought a shiver to his spine, though the room was warm. His uniform jacket rested over the back of a chair, immaculate even in disuse. His dark eyes traced a list of decommissioned transmitters and telescopes he had pulled from archived sales records, the letters and numbers blurring slightly as he read. Everything was there, ink faded and yellowed, but the crucial detail, the one that might turn their desperate hopes into something tangible, remained elusive. Reed's hand brushed over a folded newspaper clipping beneath the notebook, brittle with age. It hinted at a large radio telescope, once operational, near a remote valley in the Peak District, closed down a decade ago and sold to a private company that collapsed shortly after. The site had been abandoned since, the giant dish left to rust in the elements. He imagined the vast steel armature creaking slowly in the wind, the vast concave surface catching the faintest signals from the cosmos, now silent and forgotten. Finch looked up, his eyes calm but alert. "The question is whether that dish can be reactivated," he said, voice low and steady. "We need a transmitter powerful enough to penetrate the seabed, to reach whatever lies beneath the North Sea. The probes respond to signals deep in the electromagnetic spectrum. Our standard equipment won't be enough." Reed nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening. The former company's records suggest they never dismantled the dish. It was left intact, though unused. The problem is the site is isolated, and security might have tightened over the years. Not to mention the technology is obsolete. We'd have to retrofit it with modern transmitters. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass. Finch rose and began pacing slowly, the worn leather sole of his shoe scuffing against the linoleum floor. "Obsolete or not, it's the best chance we have. We'll need someone on the ground who knows how to navigate those liminal spaces. Someone who can move quietly, without attracting attention." Reed's gaze sharpened. "Jack Carver, he's got experience, marine salvage, off-the-books operations. He knows the terrain and the people who might object to our presence. If anyone can get us in, it's him." Finch stopped pacing, folding his arms. The thought of involving Jack brought a faint flicker of unease. The ex-Royal Marine operated in shadows, his methods reliable but always bordering on the edges of legality. Yet the situation demanded pragmatism over caution. Contact him quietly. No details, just enough to gauge his willingness. Meanwhile, Eleanor's voice came in softly over the phone, a calm current beneath the crackle of distant static. Thomas, I've been running the solar flare data through the latest model. The next peak is confirmed for 3 weeks' time. If we want to send any form of signal, it will have to be ready by then. Reed scribbled the date on a scrap of paper, folding it carefully before tucking it into his jacket pocket. Then we move fast. I'll start mapping the access routes around the telescope site. If it's been abandoned, we'll have to watch for wildlife, maybe squatters, and weather. The peak can be brutal this time of year. The weight of the coming weeks settled over the room like a silent tide. Finch looked toward the window, where the rain now fell steadily, each drop catching the pale light like a whisper from the sky. The quiet signal, he murmured. It has to be precise. No false alarms, no premature interference. We're threading a needle through decades of silence. Reed pulled out a worn topographical map of the Peak District, edges curled and stained. He traced a finger along a narrow track winding through the valley where the telescope lay forgotten. The cold dampness of the office seeped into his bones, but his mind raced ahead, visualizing the giant dish looming against the grey sky, the rusting steel girders stretching like the ribs of some ancient beast. That evening, Finch found himself alone in the office, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered room. He reached for Miriam Kendrick's latest archival notes, poring over faded photographs of the telescope in its operational days, the gleaming white dish a beacon of hope and scientific promise. The contrast with its current state was stark, abandoned, neglected, overshadowed by the hum of urban life and the whisper of secrets better left forgotten. A faint tapping echoed through the corridor outside, deliberate and measured. Eleanor stepped in, her coat still damp from the rain, carrying a thermos of tea. She handed it to Finch without a word, then settled into a creaking chair. The quiet between them was comfortable, charged with unspoken urgency. We're on the cusp of something, she said, voice soft but firm. If the sun's going to send its message, we need to be ready to answer. Finch nodded, taking a slow sip. The warmth spread through his chest, grounding him against the storm gathering both outside and within. Then we prepare the heartbeat. The next morning, Reed set off toward the northeast with a small rucksack and a sense of cautious resolve. The countryside was draped in a thick blanket of mist, the damp earth giving off a faintly sweet, mossy scent. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the distant cry of birds and the muted rustling of leaves. As he drove along winding country lanes, the radio played soft classical music, the notes mingling with the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. He arrived at the outskirts of the valley by midday. The landscape unfolded slowly, rolling moorland fading into rugged hills, the sky a leaden canvas, heavy with promise of more rain. Near a copse of ancient oaks, the telescope's dish emerged, enormous and spectral against the muted horizon. Rust mottled its surface like peeling paint on weathered skin. The supporting structure creaked faintly as the wind passed through the skeletal lattice. Reed climbed a narrow embankment, the grass slick with moisture, and surveyed the site. Broken fences sagged under the weight of time, and wildflowers edged the cracked concrete foundations. Small signs of human neglect mingled with nature's quiet reclamation. A fox darted through the underbrush, and a pair of kestrels circled overhead, their cries sharp and fleeting. He pulled out his phone, snapping photographs and taking notes, the frequency of bird calls, the angle of the dish, the state of the control building, all details to be relayed back to Finch and Eleanor. He made mental plans for possible entry points, noting the location of the main gate and a side access road choked with brambles. A sudden gust swept through the valley, carrying the scent of wet stone and earth. Reed closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of history settled here, beneath the rust and ruin. The dish had listened to the stars once. Perhaps it could listen again. That evening, back in London, Finch and Eleanor convened with Miriam. The archivist laid out intricate blueprints of the telescope's original wiring and transmitter schematics. "There's potential here," she said softly, tracing a finger along a faded diagram. "If we retrofit the transmitter with modern signal amplifiers, we might achieve the power needed, but it will require funding, resources, and time." Eleanor tapped her pen against the table, a rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking clock on the wall. "Time is the one thing we don't have, really. The solar peak moves closer every day." Finch inhaled deeply, the subtle scent of brewing coffee filling the small room. "Then we prioritize communications first, a skeleton crew to reactivate the dish. Jack can scout the site and report on conditions. We'll need to move quietly. Malcolm Sterling's men are watching." Miriam's eyes held steady. "The archives won't be enough to convince him. He's convinced that silence is salvation." Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, the world muted under a slate-grey sky. Finch looked toward the window, where the city lights began to blur into a hazy glow. The quiet was not emptiness, it was waiting. In the days that followed, Reed's reconnaissance brought more certainty. The dish, though weathered, was structurally sound. Access roads, while rough, remained passable. Electrical infrastructure was minimal but repairable. The control building's windows were broken, but the mainframe, stored in a subterranean vault, might still be intact beneath layers of dust. Jack Carver arrived in the early morning mist, his presence a solid anchor in the shifting currents of uncertainty. His gruff voice carried a note of reassurance as he surveyed the site with Reed. "Looks like a good place to keep secrets," he muttered, wiping rain from his face. "I can get us in and out without ruffling feathers, but we'll need to keep a low profile." Together they marked paths, inspected equipment, and outlined the first steps toward resurrection. Each detail logged carefully, each risk weighed and measured. The slow turning of the giant dish beneath the muted skies hinted at a future stirring beneath the weight of neglect. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Finch stood alone beside the ancient radar transmitter in the main room. The hum of the was distant, replaced by the subtle creak of metal and the gentle whistle of wind outside. He closed his eyes, heart steady amid the stillness, feeling the silent resonance of something awakening. A message waited to be sent, measured, deliberate, the heartbeat of a long conversation, the quiet signal. The chapter closed with the low, steady rhythm of the rain continuing outside, as the ancient dish leaned patiently toward the sky, waiting for the sun's next whisper, and the promise of a reply. The first morning light filtered pale and diffused through the narrow office window, a muted wash over scattered papers and open notebooks. Finch sat alone at the battered oak desk, the edges worn smooth by years of restless fingers tracing arcane symbols and half-formed equations. His gaze was cast not outward but inward, turning over the problem like a well-polished stone in his palm. The faint hum of the building's ancient heating system was the only sound, a quiet companion to the stillness. Outside, the city stirred to life beneath a slate-grey sky, but here, time felt suspended. He picked up a stub of pencil and began to sketch, careful lines, crossing and recrossing, forming concentric circles and spirals. Mathematical constants whispered across the page, an eternal language not bound by the idiosyncrasies of speech or culture. This was to be their greeting, a signal neither English nor any other human tongue could claim, but universal and elemental. Pi, the transcendental number that danced endlessly beyond simple fractions, would be their opening note. The graphite rubbed into the paper, faint smudges, blurring edges where the mind hesitated. To encode pi into a pattern of pulses, he reasoned, would catch the attention of any entity capable of decoding numerical sequences. It was simple, elegant, a message distilled to its barest essence, presence and awareness. He folded the page carefully, setting it aside like a fragile relic. The scent of old paper mingled with the faint metallic tang of the desk lamp's coil. Eleanor arrived quietly, a thermos of tea in one hand, a notebook clutched in the other. She watched Finch without speaking, her eyes sharp but soft with unspoken understanding. The days ahead were measured not in hours, but in the arc of solar flares and the slow, inexorable approach of the event that would provide their only window. She tapped her pen absently against the notebook's spine, a rhythmic punctuation to the silence. Pi, she said finally, breaking the quiet. A good start. Universal, but how to extend it? Something to say more than just, we exist. Finch nodded, rubbing his chin beneath the worn fabric of his jacket. The hydrogen line, he said after a pause, voice low and steady. That 1420 megahertz emission, it's the most fundamental frequency in the cosmos. If we encode that as a reference, it's a way of saying, this is how we tune in, this is our radio dial. She frowned, considering. So the signal would say, we're here, tuned to this frequency, we know how to listen. I like it. But can we fit that in a message short enough to send, before the flare? He smiled thinly, fingers tracing the outline of a circle worn into the desk surface. We have to make it concise, yes, but meaningful. The dance of numbers, the rise and fall of frequencies, they can be compressed, structured. We're not sending a speech, but a gesture. For hours he worked, the world beyond the office doors reduced to a blur of grey light and rustling papers. The mathematics became a meditation, a prayer whispered in prime numbers and logarithms. He traced the digits of pi, interleaving bursts of encoded data, each pulse timed to represent a fraction, an exponent, a ratio. The pattern unfolded slowly, deliberately, like the spiral of a seashell or the orbit of a distant planet. The room cooled as evening deepened, the scent of damp earth drifting faintly from the open window. Finch leaned back, eyes closing briefly as the sequence played in his mind. The hydrogen line frequency marked, pi embedded, and then something more. A map. A coordinate grid etched in binary, pinpointing the Earth's position relative to the Sun, their humble orbit marked with compassion and quiet certainty. It was a message not just of arrival, but recognition. We are here, it whispered, and we know you are too. Outside, distant rain began to fall, soft pattering on the window pane like a steady heartbeat. Finch felt the weight of the centuries pressing down, ancient silence answered by the pulse of stars, and a strange kinship with the unseen intelligence waiting beneath the waves. The signal was their voice cast into the void, a fragile thread connecting earthbound minds to something vast and deep. Over the next days, each iteration of the design grew more refined. Finch scribbled formulas and half-formed theories in margins, cross-referencing astrophysical constants with electromagnetic properties. Eleanor joined him regularly, offering insights grounded in data analytics and pattern recognition. Together they paced the limits of comprehension, crafting a code that was at once pure and poetic. Late one afternoon, Miriam Kendrick came by with a pile of old notebooks and manuals retrieved from the Ashdown archives. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed them before Finch, the musty smell of aging leather and brittle paper filling the air. "There might be more here on how the dish handled transmissions in the 60s, she said softly, eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. Finch accepted them with a grateful nod, the touch of the past grounding the urgency of the present. In a corner of the office, a small radio tuner crackled faintly with static, a relic from the telescope's operational days. Finch carefully adjusted the dials, imagining the vast dish turning slowly under clouded skies, its metal ribs straining against wind and time. The signal he was designing would one day flow through this space, carved from electrons and hope. When night fell, the city lights twinkled dimly through the mist, and the low murmur of distant traffic became a lullaby. Finch sat by the desk lamp's amber glow, eyes tracing sequences of ones and zeros. The mathematics had become a ritual, a silent liturgy to bridge the gulf between the known and the unfathomable. At times, he would stand, pacing the cramped room, the worn patch of floor beneath his feet a familiar comfort. The corduroy jacket, threadbare at the elbows, rustled softly with each measured step. He thought of the child in the Cotswolds field, eyes wide with wonder and fear, and the long journey back to this moment of quiet resolve. Eleanor entered with fresh tea, the steam curling upward in delicate spirals. She placed the cup beside him, her voice a gentle anchor. "The solar flare's predicted peak is in 3 days. We need to finalize the encoding and test the transmission." He nodded, sipping the tea slowly, the warmth spreading like a quiet affirmation. "It's almost ready. The message is simple but profound, a universal hello." The days traced onward, in a rhythm of light and shadow, the mathematics unfolding like a whispered conversation with the cosmos. Finch sketched a final diagram in charcoal on a large sheet, a spiral map indicating the Earth's orbit, the Sun at its center, and the encoded pulse sequences radiating outward. Jack Carver stopped by the office, his gruff voice breaking the reverie. "You'll need a signal strong enough to punch through the mess out there," he said, nodding toward the urban sprawl creeping toward the telescope site. "Interference is going to be a problem?" Finch considered. "Yes, that's why the hydrogen line frequency is crucial. It's a natural cosmic beacon, less likely to be drowned out." Jack grunted, folding his arms. "Still, we'll have to boost the amplifier. That place isn't ready for a full broadcast." Eleanor added, "We're working on retrofitting the transmitter with modern equipment. Miriam found some schematics for the original amplifiers, but we'll need contemporary parts to get the power we require." The small team's plans coalesced like the slow turning of the telescope's dish, each element interlocking with steady precision. Finch returned to the message design, now etched into his mind like an incantation. The quiet signal, a meditation in mathematics and hope. One evening, as rain traced lazy rivulets down the office window, he found himself staring at the spiral diagram long after Eleanor and Miriam had left. A soft wind stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and distant pine. Finch's thoughts drifted to the ancient deep ocean intelligence rumored beneath the North Sea waves, the strange terrestrial watchers whose probes had first drawn his attention. The message he crafted was for them as much as for the sun, an acknowledgement from one consciousness to another across the yawning gulf of silence. It was both a greeting and a promise. In the quiet that followed, he pressed a finger to the paper, as if feeling the pulse of the signal beneath the charcoal lines, the The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting alongside him. The next morning, Finch summoned the team for a review. They gathered around a cluttered table, the blueprints and printouts spread like an altar. He traced the signal sequence, explaining each element with deliberate care. Eleanor's pen tapped steadily as she took notes, occasionally exchanging a glance with Miriam, who listened with quiet reverence. Jack frowned. "It's beautiful," he admitted, "but are we sure it's enough? Will they understand it, or will it just look like noise?" Finch met his gaze calmly. "We can't know for certain, but mathematics is the closest thing we have to a universal language. It's the thread that binds all natural phenomena." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "And the hydrogen line is a cosmic standard. If there's intelligence capable of interpreting signals, it would recognize that." Miriam added softly, "It's an invitation, not a declaration. A doorway." The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that pooled across the room. Finch felt a quiet resolve settle within him, a tether anchoring him to purpose amid uncertainty. The quiet signal was ready to be born. Later, alone once more, he returned to the spiral map. His fingers traced the path of the Earth's journey around the sun, the solar flares' timing aligned with their own tentative message. Somewhere far beyond the reach of human sight, the ancient watchers waited. In the stillness, Finch whispered a silent hope, that the calm mathematics of their greeting might reach across the silence and be heard. The sky outside darkened to a deep indigo, stars glimmering faintly through scattered clouds. The quiet signal, born of careful thought and patient craft, awaited its moment to rise, like a breath held beneath the waves. The sky was a pale wash of dawn light when the convoy wound its way out of the sheltering embrace of Dartmoor's tors. A mist clung to the heather and granite, softening the edges of the world, as if the land itself was reluctant to reveal what lay ahead. Finch sat silently in the passenger seat of Reed's military green Land Rover, the engine's steady rumble beneath his thoughts. Outside, Eleanor's gaze flicked from the shifting moorland to the map spread across her lap, eyes sharp but shadowed by the weight of the journey. The road stretched narrow and twisting, snaking through villages that seemed frozen in time, their stone cottages framed by gnarled hedgerows and the occasional wisp of chimney smoke. The air carried a faint tang of peat and damp earth, mingling with the subtle metallic undertones of the vehicle's interior. Miriam sat quietly behind Finch, her fingers absently tracing the leather strap of her satchel, the soft rustling a gentle counterpoint to the engine's cadence. As they crossed into the Peak District, the landscape shifted. Rolling fields gave way to limestone cliffs, and deep valleys choked with ancient woodland. The convoy slowed as they approached the outskirts of the small town nearest the telescope site, the street still empty save for a few early risers gathering at a bakery's threshold. Reed's hands gripped the steering wheel with a quiet intensity, the familiar contours of the land awakening a distant memory behind his eyes. The telescope itself emerged gradually, a ghostly colossus framed by skeletal trees. Its immense, weathered dish tilted skyward, the once sleek metal surface mottled with rust and streaked by decades of rain. Beneath the dish, the control building crouched like a forgotten sentinel, its brickwork darkened by moss and the slow creep of time. An uneasy silence settled over the group as the vehicle came to a halt on the cracked tarmac, the scent of cold stone and lichen filling the air. Finch stepped out first, the chill of the morning pressing through his corduroy jacket. His eyes lingered on the telescope's massive frame, a structure that once represented humanity's reach into the cosmic unknown, now reduced to a relic. Around him, The team dispersed, their movements deliberate and unhurried, each absorbing the weight of this place where past aspirations lay dormant and waiting. Inside the control building, the air was thick with dust, and the faint musk of aged paper and electrical components long untouched. Rows of glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, housing obsolete instruments with dials yellowed by time. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath their footsteps, and the dim light from cracked windows cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and bend in the corners. Miriam moved deliberately toward a set of filing cabinets, the soft scrape of metal drawers pulling loose fragments of forgotten history. Eleanor crouched beside a control panel, brushing away layers of dust to reveal a tangled array of switches and gauges. The hum of old circuitry was absent, replaced instead by a profound stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. She tapped her pen rhythmically against the metal surface, her brow furrowed as she deciphered faded labels: amplifier relay, signal modulator, frequency synthesizer. Each term evoked a bygone era of analog precision now threatened by obsolescence. Reed's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "I'll get through to Nolan. He's the only one I trust with this kind of work. Doesn't ask questions, just gets it done." The name hung in the air, a flicker of certainty amid uncertainty. Finch nodded, the prospect of enlisting an outsider both necessary and unsettling. The secrecy surrounding their project left little room for error. Out beyond the building, the dish loomed against a sky now streaked with tentative blue. The metal groaned faintly in the breeze, a sound reminiscent of a breath exhaled after years of sleep. Finch ran a hand along a corroded strut, fingers tracing the cold, pocked surface, feeling the weight of decades pressing into the present. The radio telescope was a monument to forgotten dreams, yet, within its rusted bones, lay the potential for awakening. Later, the group gathered around a makeshift workbench, strewn with technical manuals and handwritten notes. Miriam spread out a faded schematic of the telescope's signal path, her eyes scanning each line with practiced precision. The original amplifiers were state-of-the-art in their time, she mused softly, but we'll need to retrofit them. Modern equipment can provide the power and clarity we require, especially with the solar flare's interference looming. Eleanor adjusted her glasses, the lenses catching the weak light. Interference is our greatest enemy. Urban encroachment has already degraded the site's isolation. We'll have to compensate with shielding and careful frequency selection. Her fingers danced over a tablet screen, layering overlays of environmental data, the quiet tapping of a pen against the table accompanying her thoughts like a metronome. Finch stood apart for a moment, watching the interplay of minds around him. The burden they carried was immense, an attempt to pierce the cosmic silence with reason and invitation. Yet, beneath the technical challenges lay a deeper uncertainty. Who might listen? Who might understand? The spiral map they had encoded was more than a signal. It was a beacon of hope, fragile and resolute. Night fell swiftly, draping the telescope in a cloak of stars. The team lit a small stove within the control room, the flickering flame casting soft amber light on faces drawn with fatigue and determination. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal trees, a constant reminder of time's relentless passage. Reed unpacked a small box of tools, his movements sure and steady despite the day's weariness. A crackle of static came through a hastily rigged radio, and with practiced calm, Reed transmitted a brief message. Moments later, a voice answered, gruff, no nonsense, with just a hint of dry humor. Nolan's presence was a balm, anchoring the fragile operation in experience and skill. Plans were made to begin systematic clearing and assessment at first light. Before sleep claimed him, Finch stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his cheeks. He looked up to the stars, the familiar constellations spinning silently overhead. Somewhere beneath these ancient lights, the watchers waited, patient, enigmatic. The quiet signal was their voice now, a fragile thread cast into the vastness, carrying the promise of understanding. Dawn broke again, the telescope bathed in the soft golden hues of morning. The team returned to their tasks, sleeves rolled up against the grime and shadows that clung stubbornly to the machinery. Reed led a small group into the dish's framework, weaving through scaffolding and rusted catwalks. Each step echoed the past and the possibility of future connection. Inside, Eleanor and Miriam catalogued components, sealing fragile archives against further decay. The scent of old paper mixed with machine oil, and the faint tang of solder, a sensory tapestry woven from the past and present. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful, punctuated by moments of quiet reflection on the enormity of their undertaking. Finch's mind drifted for a moment to the first time he'd seen the stars as a child in that Cotswolds field, the awe, the mystery. Now, decades later, he was poised on the cusp of reaching out across an unfathomable gulf. The metal fragment from the 1965 case lay secure in his pocket, a talisman of history and enigma. The afternoon light slanted through grimy windows, falling on a control panel that had not felt warmth in years. Nolan arrived then, a compact figure with quick hands and a measured gaze. He wasted no time peeling back panels and tracing circuits with a practiced eye. His calm efficiency was a counterbalance to the team's cautious hope. Nolan's voice was deliberate, tinged with a Yorkshire accent. The biggest risks corrosion and vandalism, but the core systems are intact. We'll need to replace the power supplies and recalibrate the signal modulators. He paused, eyes narrowing at a cluster of exposed wires. With some luck, she'll roar back to life. The group gathered around as Nolan detailed the plan. The work ahead was formidable, yet within it lay the thrill of resurrection, a chance to breathe modern vitality into a sleeping giant. Finch felt a quiet stirring of resolve. They were not merely restoring machinery, but reviving a possibility. As evening settled once more, the team paused outside, the telescope silhouetted against a bruised sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and wood smoke from a nearby farm. The hum of distant traffic was a reminder of the world beyond this remote place, indifferent yet intertwined with their secret mission. Finch lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward in delicate spirals. He watched the breath of the land exhale beneath the fading light, knowing that tomorrow would demand all their ingenuity and patience. The solar flare's peak drew nearer, an ominous rhythm beneath the calm. Eleanor joined him silently, offering a flask of hot tea. He accepted with a nod, the warmth a small comfort against the chill. They stood together without words, sharing the quiet moment of anticipation, the weight of history pressing softly between them. Night deepened, stars glinting like distant beacons. The telescope awaited its awakening, a sentinel poised on the brink of communication. Somewhere beneath the waves, the ancient watchers listened, patient and inscrutable. The quiet signal would soon begin its journey. The low dawn light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the telescope control room, casting long shadows across the dust-laden desks and tangled cables. Alistair Finch stood by the main console, hands resting lightly on the cold metal surface, eyes tracing the maze of blinking indicators and silent switches. The room smelled faintly of aged paper, oil, and something electrical, a subtle undertone of ozone that whispered of latent power waiting to be coaxed back to life. Outside, the dormant dish loomed immense and still, a giant slumbering beneath the pale sky. Finch's gaze drifted through the glass, noting the fine sheen of dew clinging to the metal framework, the faint rust streaks where decades of rain had kissed and scarred the surface. His breath fogged the pane as a cool breeze swept through the valley beyond. The silence was measured, expectant, as if the telescope itself held its breath. In the corner, Miriam Kendrick sat hunched over a stack of schematics and printouts, her fingers tracing lines of signal flow and circuit diagrams with a practiced precision. Her voice was low and steady as she spoke without looking up. The amplifiers require recalibration before power-up. If we push current before that, we risk damaging the input stages. Hobbs agrees? From the shadows near the doorway came a subtle rustle as Hobbs the engineer emerged. His weathered hands bore the marks of decades spent wrestling with machinery, grease stains embedded beneath his nails, small scars like faded constellations across knuckles. His eyes, steady and unreadable beneath a mop of greying hair, met Finch's briefly before flicking back to the workbench. Better to warm the circuit slowly, the old wiring's fragile. We'll start with the low voltage feeds, then ramp up, watch the thermal sensors. The room seemed to hold its breath again as Hobbs slid a worn leather briefcase open, revealing a neat array of tools, calibrated wrenches, insulated screwdrivers, a multimeter with a cracked screen. Carefully, he lifted a panel from the console, revealing a labyrinth of aged wires and corroded contacts. His fingers moved almost reverently, as if coaxing a long-lost friend to awaken. Finch allowed himself a moment, folding his arms, watching the engineer's methodical work. The years seemed to fall away. The former life of the telescope stirred beneath the cold metal. He felt the familiar tug of something deeper, a connection not just to the machine, but to the quiet promise it carried. The first hum came softly, a low vibration that rolled through the floorboards and settled in the chest like a distant heartbeat. Hobbs flicked a switch. A faint glow blossomed on the instrument panel. Miriam leaned forward, adjusting dials with delicate fingers. The smell of warm electronics blossomed. That peculiar scent of resistors warming, capacitors breathing life back into circuits, long thought silent. Outside, Eleanor Vance tapped her pen rhythmically against her notebook, eyes flicking between the live data scrolling across her screen and the slow, mechanical groan emanating from the dish's base. The giant instrument began to stir, gears grinding with a hesitant reluctance, fine dust drifting down like ancient snow. The dish creaked, then shifted imperceptibly, as though stretching after a long sleep. Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. The positional servos are responding, though there's some lag on the elevation axis. She flicked a switch, and a cluster of readouts blinked, displaying telemetry in crisp green numerals. Reed stood near the back, arms crossed, watching the slow motion of the dish. The sharp tang of sea air drifted through the cracked window, carrying the faint cries of gulls circling overhead. His uniform, immaculate as always, bore the light dust of the control room. These old motors will need greasing after decades of neglect. Hobbs has his work cut out. The engineer didn't respond, but his hands moved with quiet assurance, opening a maintenance hatch to spray a fine mist of lubricant into the gear teeth. The faint hiss of the aerosol mingled with the grinding gears and the low electrical hum, creating a symphony of rebirth. Finch moved closer to a rattled cables. Miriam joined him, her breath shallow but steady, as she pointed to a panel. The signal modulators need shielding upgrades. Urban interference has increased exponentially since the 70s. We'll have to retrofit ferrite cores here and here. And recalibrate the filters to compensate. Finch nodded thoughtfully, tracing the lines she indicated. The task felt monumental, but the urgency of the approaching solar flare sharpened the air around them. Time is a luxury we don't have, he murmured, more to himself than anyone. But we must be precise. Later that afternoon, the sun dipped behind low hills, sending a wash of amber light through the dusty windows. The team worked in quiet rotation. The room bathed in a warm glow from desk lamps and the steady pulse of various screens. Eleanor brewed tea in a battered kettle, the sharp scent of black leaves steeping in hot water mixing with the underlying notes of heated circuitry. Hobbs sat on a battered metal stool, his face illuminated by a small soldering iron's orange tip. Sparks danced briefly as he mended a fractured connection, the smell of melting flux sharp and acrid in the enclosed space. Every so often his lips pressed into a thin line, eyes narrowing as he measured resistance and continuity. Reed leaned against the window frame, his gaze distant as the night thickened outside. The cold seeped in around the edges of the building, carried on gusts that rattled loose panes, and sent leaves skittering across the concrete apron beneath the dish. He pulled his uniform jacket tighter around his shoulders, the fabric whispering with the movement. Miriam sifted through a pile of weathered blueprints, her fingers brushing dust from delicate creases. If we can synchronize the timing circuits to the observatory's atomic clock, we might reduce latency in the signal processing by 20%, she said softly, voice threading through the quiet as the team absorbed the thought. Finch paced slowly by the console, the worn sole of his shoe dragging faintly over the dusty floor. His dry wit surfaced briefly. Atomic clock, you say? A little precision never hurt anyone, except perhaps a nervous mathematician. Laughter was sparse but genuine, a brief fracture in the long hours. Eleanor's cadence of pen-tapping resumed, steady and soothing, as she set to recalibrating receivers. The gentle clatter of keys and faint hum of air conditioning mingled with the scent of earth and oil, creating a cocoon of focus. Overhead, the dish's slow rotation continued. The grinding softened as Hobbs adjusted gear tension, the massive structure shifting toward a preset vector. The sound was a low, enduring groan, the song of something ancient awakening. Night deepened, and the valley settled into a fragile quiet. Outside, stars blinked cold and distant, indifferent witnesses to the human efforts below. Finch found himself drawn to the windows again, his reflection haloed in the glass. The metal fragment from 1965 lay heavy in his palm, a silent talisman bridging past and present. Suddenly, a soft beat from the console cut through the stillness. Eleanor's voice lifted, calm and clear. Signal strength rising, noise floor dropping, the filters are stabilizing. Hobbs nodded, eyes squinting at a cluster of monitors. Almost there. just a few more adjustments. Finch exhaled slowly, his pacing slowing. The old telescope was no longer merely a relic. It breathed beneath their hands, poised to speak across the void. The weight of decades pressed lightly, a mantle shared among them. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The team worked in concert, bodies tired but minds alight. The room pulsed with a hum of energy, electrical, intellectual, spiritual. The dish moved steadily, its arc a slow carving through the night's glassy silence. At one point, Eleanor paused, staring intently at a spectral display. There's a subtle irregularity in the background interference. Could be local power lines, or maybe something more. Finch's gaze sharpened. Document it. Every anomaly counts. Miriam leaned closer to the same screen, lips barely parted. This pattern, it's reminiscent of the magnetic anomalies from the 1965 Ashdown records. A shiver, almost unnoticed, passed through the room. The past and present converged in data and dust. Near midnight, Reed approached the console, the weight of unspoken doubt in his eyes. You think it'll hear us? Finch met his gaze evenly. If anything is watching, it will, and if it listens, so must we. The engineer's hands moved with deliberate care, tightening a worn bolt beneath the panel. The dish shifted again, a slow, deliberate pivot toward the assigned coordinates. The mechanical chorus rose in volume, a deep vibration that settled into their bones. Outside, the night drifted on, the world hushed beneath a canopy of stars that neither judged nor answered. Within the control room, hope stirred quietly. Fragile as the first breath of dawn, subtle as the scent of warm metal and rising ozone. As the first hints of pre-dawn grey softened the horizon, Finch stood by the console, watching the array of lights and meters. The telescope was awake now, its ancient heart beating beneath their hands, ready to send their quiet signal into the vast unknown. The moment balanced on the edge of silence and sound, of darkness and light, as the team prepared for what might come next. The low beam of the desk lamp cast a pale pool of light across the cluttered workbench. Alistair Finch's fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the corroded vacuum tube from the transmitter array. The glass envelope was mottled with a fine crust of verdigris, the metal pins blackened and brittle. He traced the outline of the tube, cold and fragile in his palm, as though it were a relic of a distant age rather than a piece of critical equipment. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, mingling with the warmth of the lamp and the faint hum of the old electronics that surrounded them. Eleanor bent over the schematic spread across the table, her pen tapping against the paper with a rhythmic precision. She looked up, eyes steady beneath the glow. That's the Exon-27, she said softly, voice low and deliberate. A vacuum trio designed for transmitting in the mid-20th century. It hasn't been made since the early 80s. Her fingers hovered over the annotated diagrams, fingers stained with graphite and oil, betraying the long hours of labor. Thomas Reed stood in the corner of the cramped APRO office, arms folded over his immaculate uniform jacket. The faint scent of rain clung to his coat from the evening air outside. His eyes reflected a quiet frustration, tempered by a sense of purpose. So that means we're out of luck unless we can find a replacement, and they don't exactly grow on trees. His voice was calm but firm, edged with an impatience he rarely showed. Miriam Kendrick, seated at her desk, surrounded by stacks of archival folders, looked up from a faded ledger. Her fingers paused over the worn paper, tracing a line of typed text. There may be a chance, she said quietly. I know of a network of dealers specializing in vintage electronics. Some of them still have stock or salvaged components from that era. Her eyes held a flicker of cautious hope, a small beacon amid the mounting pressure. Alistair nodded slowly, folding the fragile tube carefully back into its protective box. The room felt suddenly colder, as though the weight of decades pressed down upon them. Reed, can you follow up on that? We need this part if we're going to continue. His voice was measured, betraying no hint of the urgency that tightened his chest. The responsibility of the mission weighed heavily, but his demeanor remained calm, a steady anchor for the team. Reed's jaw clenched, the lines around his mouth deepening. I'll start first thing tomorrow. I'll check every lead. He pushed off from the wall, the creak of his boots soft against the worn floorboards. If anyone knows where to find a needle in a haystack, it's me. The faint humor in his voice was a welcome reprieve from the tension, a thread of human resilience stitching them together. Late into the next day, the air outside darkened with a gathering storm, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the APRO office. Eleanor leaned over her keyboard, fingers moving with practiced ease. She scrolled through online forums and obscure databases, the faint click of the keys punctuating the quiet. Her mind sifted through the digital maze, searching for a whisper of hope amid the static. Miriam brought her a tepid cup of tea, the aroma of bergamot filling the cramped room. Keep at it, she said softly, her voice a gentle encouragement. These old parts find new life in unexpected places. The warmth of the tea contrasted with the chill seeping through the building's aging walls, a small comfort in the long night. Reed returned, just before dusk, carrying a worn leather satchel heavy with promise. "I've found one," he said simply, voice low but steady, "in Sheffield, a small shop specializing in obscure vacuum tubes. They had a single XN27 left, untested, but apparently intact." His eyes held a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. "I'm going to collect it tonight." The weight of the task ahead settled over him like the cold night air waiting outside. The team gathered briefly, the tired faces illuminated by the flickering glow of fluorescent bulbs. Alistair's hands folded over each other, his gaze steady. "Drive safe, Reed. We need that tube." The words were spare, but carried the heft of their shared mission. Eleanor nodded, her pen tapping a steady rhythm against her notebook. "We'll be here when you return." The quiet solidarity between them was a balm against the uncertain night ahead. Reed's car roared to life, the engine's growl breaking the stillness of the early evening. The scent of damp earth and petrol mingled in the cool air as he pulled away from the London streets, headlights cutting through the thickening mist. The rhythmic pulse of the wipers against the glass echoed the steady cadence of his thoughts as miles of motorway stretched endlessly before him. The journey northward was marked by the steady drumming of rain against the windshield, the road reflecting the ghostly glow of distant streetlights. Fields blurred past, dark and sodden, shadows stretching long beneath the stormy sky. Inside the car, the hum of the engine was a constant companion, a mechanical heartbeat amid the natural quiet. Reed's mind wandered to the meaning of their work, the ancient signal waiting to be heard beyond the veil of noise, the fragile thread connecting their present to a past shrouded in secrecy. He thought of Finch's worn corduroy jacket, the metal fragment resting on the desk at the APRO office, the whispered stories held in the archives, the weight of history pressed lightly yet insistently. Arriving in Sheffield in the dead of night, Reed found the shop nestled between shuttered storefronts. A faint yellow light spilled from the dusty window, illuminating rows of glass jars and tangled coils visible through the panes. The scent of aged wood and oil mingled with the faint aroma of tobacco smoke drifting from inside. He stepped through the threshold, the bell above the door jingling softly. The shopkeeper, a thin man, with lined features and keen eyes, greeted him with a cautious smile. "Looking for something special, are you?" His voice was smooth, edged with curiosity. Reed produced a folded note from Finch's hand, the seal cracked but intact. "An XN27 triode," he said simply, "in good condition." The man nodded, reaching beneath the counter to retrieve a small box wrapped carefully in brown paper. Inside, the vacuum tube gleamed faintly under the dim light, its glass surface free of the green patina that marked the one they'd found corroded. Reed turned it over reverently, the fine wiring and filaments visible within. "It's what we need," he murmured, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The shopkeeper wrapped it again, accepting an agreed sum with a nod. "Good luck with it," he said, voice carrying a hint of understanding. The drive back was longer, the rain having eased to a fine drizzle. The roads slick beneath the tires, reflecting the haloed glow of occasional street lamps. Reed's hands gripped the steering wheel with steady resolve, the vacuum tube secured carefully in its protective case beside him. Somewhere deep in the night, the faint pulse of the sea mingled with the distant rumble of surf against the Suffolk coast. Returning to the APRO office in the early hours, Reed greeted by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the gentle rustle of papers. Eleanor looked up from her notes, eyes bright despite exhaustion. Miriam offered a smile, the corners of her mouth lifting in quiet approval. Finch rose from his chair, the pallid light catching the fine lines etched across his face. "Welcome back," he said softly. The vacuum tube was unwrapped and examined under Eleanor's steady hands, the delicate glass and fine filament scrutinized with practiced care. Hobbs, the engineer, prepared the transmitter array, his fingers deftly cleaning contacts and aligning components. The air was thick with anticipation, the scent of warm electronics mingling with the faint aroma of tea brewing in the corner. Slowly, methodically, the new tube was seated in place, the pins fitting snugly into their sockets. The machinery hummed to life, a soft vibration coursing through the room. Eleanor adjusted the tuning circuits, her breath steady as the signal began to build. The faint crackle of static gave way to a clearer tone, a fragile thread of sound bridging decades and mysteries. A lister paced once, twice, the worn corduroy jacket brushing against the dusty shelves. He paused by the window, gazing out at the dim shimmer of London's skyline beneath a sky heavy with clouds. Somewhere beyond the city lights, the ancient intelligence waited, silent, patient, its signal poised to be heard. The quiet determination of the team coalesced into a fragile hope. Reed settled into a chair, rubbing the weariness from his eyes. "It's holding steady," he said, voice low but firm. "The transmitter is responding as it should." Eleanor smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. Miriam poured a fresh cup of tea, the warmth a small comfort, against the chill settling into the old building. The hours slipped by in a slow, measured rhythm. The team moved with practiced efficiency, calibrating, adjusting, listening. Outside, the city was a distant murmur beneath the steady pulse of rain, the night deep and endless. Within the room, the fragile light of possibility flickered, a quiet signal against the darkness. As dawn began to pale the sky, the telescope's great dish creaked softly, turning toward the east. A new day was arriving, heavy with promise and uncertainty. Finch gathered the team quietly, his gaze steady and resolute. "We're ready," he said, voice calm and measured. "Whatever comes next, we are listening." The fragile hope lingered, suspended on the edge of the morning light. The night outside the cramped APRO office pressed in like a thick, velvet curtain, muffling the distant city hum. Rain whispered against the window pane, a steady pattering that folded into the hum of old electronics and the low murmur of voices. Eleanor sat at the battered oak desk, her fingers moving fluently over the keyboard, eyes flicking between lines of code and a small cluster of live news feeds. The glow from the monitor etched sharp reflections on her glasses, the soft blue light mingling with the amber hues of the desk lamp. Steam curled upward from a chipped ceramic mug beside her, the scent of strong black tea punctuating the damp London air. Her gaze narrowed as an alert blinked on one of the news streams, a report of unexplained inquiries at addresses linked to APRO's known associates. The words were quiet but loaded. Official investigations into unusual communications from former employees. Eleanor's fingers hesitated before she quickly tapped a message into a secure channel. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, but threaded with steel. They're getting closer. Sterling's people are moving fast. Across the room, Finch was hunched over a weathered blueprint of the telescope's transmitter array, fingers tracing the intricate circuitry with a practiced touch. The lines and nodes blurred slightly under his tired eyes, but his mind was sharp, cataloguing every detail, every potential point of failure. His worn corduroy jacket creaked softly as he shifted, pacing a slow figure eight around the room, the faint scrape of his shoes on the scuffed wooden floor a metronome to the urgency that filled the space. He stopped by the window for a moment, staring out into the rain-misted darkness, the city lights smeared into halos behind the droplets, as if the whole world was underwater, held in suspension. Miriam's quiet presence was a constant beneath the storm of activity. She moved methodically between stacks of archived documents and computer terminals, her fingers deft and sure as she cross-referenced data points. The scent of old paper and ink filled the narrow office, a comforting, musty perfume that seemed to anchor the team in history, even as the present pressed in with relentless urgency. "We have roughly 4 days before the solar event peaks," she said softly, almost to herself, her voice a calm counterpoint to the tension. "Every minute counts." Reed sat near the door, shoulders squared, dark eyes scanning the rain-streaked window as he nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee. The weight of the mission pressed on him, a quiet gravity that no amount of dry humor could fully dissipate tonight. The soft rustling of papers and quiet tapping of Eleanor's pen against her notebook punctuated the silence. He let out a slow breath, the cold seeping through the cracked window frame, reminding him that time was not on their side. "If Sterling's agents think they can just walk in and shut us down, they don't know what we're dealing with," he murmured, the rasp of his voice threading through the room like a shadow. Outside, the city was a blurred collage of headlights and neon signs, the rain softening the edges of reality into a dreamscape. Eleanor's phone buzzed quietly on the desk. She glanced at the screen, a text from an old contact at GCHQ. "Increased activity here. Unmarked vans near Ashworth. Be careful." The words carried weight beyond their brevity. She tapped back a quick, measured reply, then returned her focus to the screen. "They're deploying field teams to intercept any electronic signals. They want to cut us off before we even broadcast." The low hum of the transmitter array filled the room as Hobbs and Miriam adjusted the final calibrations. The machinery was ancient and delicate, a fragile bridge to the past, and every turn of the wrench or flick of a switch was performed with reverence. A faint metallic scent mingled with the warmth of heated circuits, the subtle vibration underfoot, a reminder of the dormant power waiting to be unleashed. Finch traced the curve of the telescope's dish on the schematic, his voice calm but purposeful. Orientation is set eastward. We're listening to the horizon where the signal should emerge. Outside, the rain began to ease, leaving a thin, silvery film over the pavement. The chill seeped through the walls, curling around the edges of the room and settling in the bones. Eleanor pulled on a thin cardigan, her fingers brisk, as she typed again, eyes flicking between multiple data streams. Multiple civilians have reported strange lights near fault lines linked to the power grid. The pattern matches the Rendlesham timeline more closely than we thought. She paused, tapping her pen against the desk, the rhythmic sound sharp in the quiet. The probes are responding already. Finch approached the central console, the faint scratch of his jacket punctuating the silence. Then we have very little time. If the probes are moving along fault intersections, the energy from the upcoming solar event could be the trigger. We're at the cusp of something we've never truly seen before. His voice was steady, the weight of decades of unanswered questions folded into each measured word. He looked at Reed, who nodded, fingers tightening around his coffee cup. Miriam's eyes lifted from a brittle file folder detailing radar readings from the 1960s. Arthur Hayes tapes, the ones from 64 and 65, they're consistent with recent anomalies. The cover-up was comprehensive, but the data never disappeared. It was just waiting. She brushed a strand of grey hair behind her ear, the soft rustle of paper accompanying her movement. We owe him the truth. The office door creaked open quietly, and Hobbs slipped inside, wiping grease-streaked hands on a rag. His voice was low but urgent. The last antenna array alignment is complete. We've got about 96 hours before the solar flare peaks. Power systems are stable, but I won't lie, the window for error is razor thin. The metallic scent of solder and oil clung to him, underscoring the physical toll of the work. Eleanor's fingers paused over the keyboard. I just heard from Larkspur. They're intercepting encrypted communications, consistent with Sterling's agents coordinating search patterns. They're closing the net. She sighed, the sound barely audible but laden with concern. The rain had stopped, leaving the city outside slick and reflective, the faint orange glow of streetlights blurred by lingering mist. We must accelerate. Finch moved again to the window, resting his palm against the cool glass. His breath fogged a small circle, a fragile barrier between the warmth inside and the encroaching cold without. If we fail to send the signal, the silence will be permanent. His voice was almost a whisper, carrying years of quiet desperation. This is our last chance. Reed stood, stretching long limbs cramped from hours of sitting. He drew a slow breath, the scent of damp stone and aged concrete filtering through the cracked window. Then we work through the night. We don't stop until the signal is sent. His gaze met Eleanor's, who nodded, the tapping pen now replaced by steady typing. Miriam began sorting through the archive boxes once more, pulling out a fragile map marked with geological fault lines and power grids. The paper was brittle, edges faded to sepia tones. She laid it carefully on the desk, tracing the intersecting lines with a finger. These are the paths the probes follow. We've identified the key nodes. Stellar activity will amplify their transmissions. Her voice was steady, the weight of certainty a balm amidst the growing storm of uncertainty. The room filled with the steady rhythm of teamwork, keyboards clicking, whispered consultations, the occasional soft cough or scrape of a chair. The ancient vacuum tube in the transmitter glowed faintly, a tiny beacon of hope in the dimness. Finch adjusted the controls, the gentle hiss of current flowing through the circuits like a whispered promise. We're almost ready. The array is humming in tune with the solar forecast. Outside, a distant siren wailed faintly, swallowed by the city's deep shadows and the thickening night air. Eleanor glanced at her phone again, another message blinking onto the screen. Larkspur confirms, unmarked vehicles spotted near the Ashdown archives. Sterling's men are moving on multiple fronts. She swallowed the rising knot of tension, steadying herself with a sip of cooling tea. We need contingency plans. Reed pulled his jacket tighter against the chill creeping in through the old window frames. The familiar weight was grounding, a small comfort, as the urgency mounted. He moved to the console beside Finch, fingers hovering over the controls. We're standing on the edge of something vast. Let's make sure we're ready to leap. The first faint light of dawn began to seep through the rain-streaked glass, pale as memory and fragile as hope. The team gathered near the transmitter array, faces drawn but resolute. Finch's voice cut through the quiet, measured and clear. We're ready. We are listening. The words hung in the still air, a whispered invocation to the unknown. As the telescope's dish creaked slowly on its axis, turning eastward toward the awakening horizon, the room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the city stirred beneath a thinning veil of mist, the day poised to begin. The quiet signal waited, a thread stretched taut across time and space, ready to unravel the secrets long buried beneath the surface. The telescope stood in mute grandeur beneath the low, cavernous ceiling of the Peak District Valley, its great parabolic dish poised like a sleeping leviathan. Dust motes quivered in the dim illumination of aging tungsten bulbs, faint whirs and creaks punctuating the stillness as the ancient machinery settled into alignment. Outside, a grey drizzle traced serpentine paths down weathered slates, wrapping the valley in a shawl of damp cold that seeped through boots and bones alike. Alistair Finch moved slowly around the control console, fingers lightly grazing the worn edges of the dials and switches, his corduroy jacket whispering with each careful step. The air smelled faintly of oil and old paper with a trace of moss from the stone walls beyond. In the cramped control room adjoining the telescope, Miriam Kendrick crouched beside the radiant transmitter matrix, her hands steady as she adjusted the fragile, time-worn calibrations. A soft pulse hummed from the ancient electronics, resonating through the metal floor and into the soles of her shoes. She inhaled deeply, the mixture of warm circuits and cold stone filling her lungs with an odd comfort. Around her, cables curled like sleeping serpents, their insulation cracked but still faithful to their tasks. The smell of resin and solder lingered, mingling with the faint, musty trace of archival dust from the crates stacked in the corner. Hobbs, the technician who had become indispensable over the past weeks, crouched opposite Miriam, his brow furrowed as he watched the slowly climbing signal strength on a battered oscilloscope screen. His fingers tapped a nervous rhythm against the metal casing, the only audible punctuation in the stillness apart from the soft hum. "Power levels steady," he whispered, voice low, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile moment. The glow from the screen cast harsh shadows across his lined face, the fatigue etched deep beneath dark eyes that had seen too many restless nights. Alistair's voice, calm and precise, broke the quiet like a gentle tide. "Run the test sequence. We need to confirm the beam's focus on the seabed coordinates." His gaze lifted from the console, steady and unwavering, the pale blue of his eyes reflecting the flickering screen. There was no tremor in his voice, only the quiet weight of responsibility. The others exchanged glances, the electrical tension palpable but tempered by shared resolve. Outside the window, the rain softened to a fine mist, dimming the world beyond to a misty watercolor wash. Eleanor Vance stood apart by a narrow desk cluttered with printouts and monitors, her fingers flying over a keyboard. The faint tap-tap of her pen against the notebook rested beside her, a deliberate metronome to her thoughts. She scrolled through layers of recent data, geomagnetic readings, fault line activity, civilian reports filtered through GC HQ's encrypted channels. Her eyes narrowed as lines of code and graphs coalesced into a pattern that was both terrifying and beautiful in its precision. "The solar flare prediction is locked in," she said without turning, voice crisp but low. "Largest X-class in years, peak arrival in 48 hours. Her fingers paused, hovering over a key before typing a command that brought up a shimmering graph of solar flux. She tapped twice against the wood of the desk, breath catching for a moment, as the numbers confirmed the forecast. The flare would saturate the upper atmosphere with charged particles, amplifying the transmission range. This was their narrow window, perhaps the only one. Alistair closed his eyes for a brief moment, the familiar pacing rhythm beginning as he moved away from the console. The worn heels of his jacket scraped softly against the cold floor. He stepped toward the back of the room, hands clasped behind his back, and began quietly running through the signal design in his mind. The pattern was complex but elegant. The sequence intended not just to broadcast, but to resonate with the peculiar frequencies that their quarry, hidden beneath the North Sea, would recognize. It was a language born of years spent translating the silent signals buried beneath layers of government obfuscation. Miriam straightened, the quiet lines of weariness drawn tight across her face betraying the steel beneath. She moved to the small wooden table littered with faded photographs and yellowing documents, echoes of a time when the world was less sure of its own shadows. Her fingers brushed a brittle sheet of radar tape, the ghostly traces of those ancient echoes etched like fingerprints against the spools. "They hid this for so long," she murmured, voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and relief. 50 years of silence, and now we stand on the edge of breaking it. Hobbs adjusted a dial, eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as a distant rumble echoed through the valley, the muted sound of an approaching storm, or perhaps something more. "If Sterling's men are this close now, they'll be here any minute," he said, the dry humor in his voice a fragile shield. "Not much time to dawdle." He glanced at Eleanor, who merely nodded, her gaze never leaving her screens. Alistair returned to the console, drawing a breath that seemed to pull the night air deep into his lungs. "We'll send the test transmission now," he said. "Confirm the beam's alignment, power output, and clarity." His fingers danced across the controls with practiced ease. The ancient dish groaned as it responded, small motors whirring softly as the great surface pivoted slowly eastward, aiming precisely toward the coordinates beneath the turbulent North Sea. The transmitter emitted a low-frequency pulse, a rhythmic throb that echoed faintly through the stone chamber. The signal strength climbed steadily on the monitors, a growing beacon in the static. Eleanor peered at a secondary display tracking signal reflections, nodding once as the beam locked onto the seabed target with crisp precision. "Signal stable," she confirmed, her voice quiet but certain. "No interference detected." Her habitual pen-tapping slowed, fingers curling loosely around the slender instrument. Minutes stretched into a meditative rhythm, the team collectively holding their breath as the equipment hummed in synchrony. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the edges of the windows and stirring the creeping fog that clung to the hillside. The scent of wet earth and salt hung faintly in the air, as if the sea itself were waiting to answer a call long overdue. Alistair stepped back, hands resting lightly on the console. "The pattern is ready," he said, eyes bright beneath the soft glow of the panels. 2 days until the flare. That will be our moment." His voice carried the weight of quiet certainty, the calm before the storm of revelation. Everything hinges on precision and timing. Eleanor closed her laptop, the sudden click a soft punctuation in the thickening stillness. She rose and walked to the small window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. The world beyond was a landscape of shadow and rain, shadows pooling in the hollows of the valley like spilled ink. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the civilian reports. The strange lights near fault lines, the inexplicable patterns that had confounded decades of experts and skeptics alike. This was no coincidence. Miriam returned to the archive boxes, pulling out a fragile binder of classified memos and photographs from the Rendlesham case. The edges of the paper curled with age. Ink faded, but words still sharp. She read silently, the weight of history pressing heavily. The years of suppression, the carefully maintained narrative of denial. It all converged here, in this damp stone chamber beneath the watchful gaze of the telescope. Hobbs lit a cigarette with a practiced flick, the brief flare of the match illuminating his weary face. He took a slow drag, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals that mingled with the stale air. "You know," he said softly, exhaling, "sometimes I wonder if the truth is the luxury we can't afford. If people could understand what's out there, would they even want to?" Alistair's gaze met his steady, dark eyes. "Ignorance is a brittle shield," he replied, "one that breaks when the storm comes. Our task is to hold it together until then." He gestured toward the glowing indicators. "The signal is the first crack in that shield. If we succeed, it won't be long before the world sees the fracture lines." The night deepened, shadows growing longer as the storm outside intensified. Eleanor returned to her seat, fingers resuming their rhythmic tapping on the notebook. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of rain and old paper, grounding herself. The pressure of impending revelation pressed gently against her thoughts. A quiet insistence that truth, no matter how unsettling, was a light waiting to be kindled. Alistair, he told her, moved to the rear of the room, standing beneath the telescope's great curved silhouette. He raised his hand, brushing the cool metal with reverence. "It's a conversation," he murmured, voice barely audible. A quiet signal sent into the dark, hoping to be heard. His shoulders relaxed fractionally, the tension of months folding into a fragile calm. Outside, the wind screamed briefly, rattling shutters and sending loose stones skittering down the hillside. The rain hammered the roof in steady, rhythmic drumming. A lullaby for secrets long buried beneath the waves. In the silence that followed, the hum of the transmitter persisted, steady, unwavering. The team settled into their separate corners of the room, each alone with their thoughts, yet bound by unspoken understanding. The seconds stretched, measured and deliberate. Somewhere beneath the restless sea, the ancient intelligence stirred, listening. The moment approached. Alistair finally looked toward the small clock on the wall, its hands inching steadily forward. 2 days, he said softly. That is all we have. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, a calm before revelation and rupture. We must be ready. The telescope's great dish caught a stray flicker of lightning beyond the valley rim, a brief flare of light against the darkening sky. In that fleeting illumination, the team glimpsed the fragile threshold they were crossing, a boundary between silence and signal, between fear and understanding. Outside, the rain softened once more, as if the world held its breath in anticipation. Inside, the quiet signal pulsed steadily, a heartbeat in the deep. The next chapter awaited. The chamber was wrapped in a quiet so complete it seemed to absorb the storm's relentless rhythm above. Rain thrummed against the slate roof, a steady pulse beneath the low hum of vintage electronics, their dials casting a muted glow across the faces gathered in the circle of worn chairs. The air smelled of cold stone and old paper, occasionally tinged with the sharper bite of freshly brewed tea. Outside, gusts tugged at the gnarled oaks on the hillside, leaves whispering secrets to the night. Alistair sat with his corduroy jacket draped loosely over his shoulders, fingers interlaced as he leaned forward, eyes distant. The weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders. But beneath the tension, there was a fragile calm, a steadiness born of years spent chasing shadows. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, a thread weaving through the stillness. I was 10, maybe 11. That night, in the Cotswolds, the sky was impossibly clear, cold and crystalline. We'd been camping with my father, his telescope set up on a ridge overlooking the valley. He paused, the memory unfolding slowly. I saw something, not quite like the stars, but not like anything else I'd known, a pulse of light, hovering, silent. I called to him, but when he looked it was gone. I told no one. The others listened in silence, Eleanor's fingers drumming softly against the ceramic rim of her mug, the sound a gentle counterpoint to the storm. I stopped being a skeptic on a wet Tuesday afternoon, she said, her voice steady but edged with the echo of disbelief. I was poring over data streams looking for patterns, anomalies. There it was, a signal buried beneath the noise, impossible to explain by any conventional means. It wasn't just that it existed, it was the precision, the patterning, the subtlety. It demanded attention. Her gaze lifted to the Rain Street window. That day I realized truth isn't a matter of belief, it's a matter of evidence. The warmth of the tea filled the silence for a moment before Reed's voice cut through, dry and pragmatic. I saw it on patrol just off the North Sea. Night thick as ink, everything else quiet. Instruments went haywire, the horizon lit with pale, shifting shapes, no aircraft, no ships, just something else. His hands, smooth and calloused from years in uniform, clenched briefly on his lap. Grounded since, but the memory never fades. It's why I'm here, because no one else could tell it like it was. The three of them sat together, a triad bound by the unspoken cost of their convictions. Alistair's gaze flicked to the ancient transmitter, its dials poised for a message no one outside this room could understand. We're on the edge of something vast, not just a signal, but a fracture in the wall of silence. His fingers traced invisible patterns in the air. For decades, they've tried to contain it, to explain it away. Sterling fears what the truth would unravel, but ignorance is a brittle thing. Eleanor nodded, eyes fixed on the flickering readouts. Each anomaly, every sighting near the fault lines, it's all connected. The intelligence beneath the sea, watching, waiting, our transmission will be the first real conversation. She tapped her pen against the notebook, the rhythmic sound a soft punctuation in the dim light. It's extraordinary to think they've been here far longer than us, hidden beneath layers of rock and water, sending their silent sentinels to monitor the Earth's breath. Outside, the storm's fury softened, rain easing into a steady drizzle. The hills beyond the chamber were silhouettes softened by mist, the first whispers of dawn creeping across the sky. The world held its breath, a paused heartbeat in the vastness of time. Alistair's voice lowered, threading through the quiet. I wonder if the moment I saw that light as a child was always meant to lead me here. To this exact point, with all of you. The years of doubt, the nights alone with my thoughts. It feels like a long, slow stitching of bittersweet. His eyes glimmered with the weight of unspoken memories. I never imagined the truth would be this profound, or this fragile. Eleanor poured fresh tea, the steam curling between them like a soft veil. There's comfort in knowing we're not alone in this, she said softly, even if what we face isn't human, not in any sense we understand. She sipped, eyes closing briefly against the weariness. It's a quiet kind of horror, isn't it? Facing an intelligence so ancient, so utterly indifferent to us. Reed shifted in his seat, gloves folded neatly beside him. I've spent years flying over the sea, searching for answers. This is what it all leads to, a reckoning maybe, or a conversation we never knew we needed. His gaze was steady, the weight of his experience settling around them like a cloak. Whatever happens, we're the ones who dared to listen. Miriam, who had been quietly sorting through a worn, leather-bound folder, looked up with a hint of a smile. There's a strange kind of solace in the archives, she said. The truth buried for decades, finally breathing again. I found records linking the Rendlesham files to the earliest signals. It's a pattern hidden beneath layers of obfuscation, each revelation a step closer to light. Her voice was gentle yet resolute. We carry the past within us, even as we reach for the future. Outside, the mist thickened, weaving through the skeletal branches and softening the edges of the world. The scent of damp earth rose, mingling with the faint ozone tang left by the storm's passing. The chamber felt like a sanctuary against the vast unknown, a fragile bastion of human hope. Alistair rose slowly, stretching his limbs. 2 days until the flare. The moment when our signal will join the solar wind cutting through the silence. He glanced at each of them, a quiet command in his eyes. It's not just a transmission, it's a question, an invitation. We don't know what will come back, but we have to be ready, whatever it is. Eleanor closed her notebook, the soft snap of the cover marking a pause. We prepared for months, piecing together every fragment, every whisper. Now all that remains is to wait and to listen. Her fingers traced the edge of the table absently, mind already racing through contingencies. This moment defines everything. Reed leaned forward, voice low. It's strange, isn't it? The calm before the storm, all that uncertainty. Yet here we are, together. On the brink. His dark eyes flickered with a rare vulnerability. No one else would understand why we stayed, why we risked everything. But we do. The chamber's shadows deepened as the night advanced, the faint click of a relay and the soft crackle of static filling the spaces between their words. The ancient equipment, relics from a different era of exploration, seemed to hum with anticipation. Each dial, each wire, a testament to the decades of secrecy and hope entwined beneath the earth. Miriam's voice broke the silence once more. There's a passage in one of the old reports, a line that stuck with me. The boundary between knowledge and fear is thinner than a whisper. We've crossed that boundary. She smiled faintly, eyes reflecting the dim light. There's no going back. Outside, the first pale light brushed the crest of the hills, softening the harsh outlines of rock and tree. The dawn was slow, deliberate, as if the land itself was drawing breath in anticipation. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving a quiet residue of dampness and the faintest chill. Alistair stood by the window watching the horizon. The sky unfolded in muted shades of grey and blue, clouds parting in tentative invitation. "This morning is a promise," he murmured. "A promise of change, of revelation. We're about to speak truths that have lingered in darkness for too long." Eleanor joined him, her presence steady and reassuring. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. No more silence." Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of all they had endured. The chamber grew still, save for the soft whir of the equipment and the pulse of their shared resolve. Outside the Peak District hills stood silent witness, ancient as the secrets they guarded. Reed looked once more toward the window, then back at his companions. "We wait," he said simply, "and we listen." The dawn light deepened, spilling across the chamber floor like the first tentative notes of a new symphony. The quiet held, fragile yet unyielding, as the long hours stretched before them, a threshold between what was known and what was waiting to be heard. In the fading shadows, the team settled into a collective silence, each lost in their own reflections yet united in purpose. The storm had passed, but a greater tempest loomed, and as the sun rose over the ancient hills, they prepared to send their quiet signal into the vast unknown. The first light of dawn seeped through the narrow slit of the chamber's single window, painting the cold stone walls with a pale, ethereal glow. Outside, the Peak District hills stood muted against a sky that shimmered with an unnatural green hue, a faint aurora creeping southward in delicate, rhythmic waves. The air held a peculiar tension, charged and still, like the breath before a whispered truth. Alistair Finch stood near the main console, his fingers trailing lightly over the worn surface, a faint hum vibrating beneath his touch. He wore his usual corduroy jacket, its sleeves frayed, at the cuffs, the fabric softened by years of constant wear. His eyes, steady but distant, traced the patterns of data scrolling across the monitor, confirming one last time the integrity of the signal they were to send. The message was simple, a precise sequence of mathematical pulses encoded to pierce the vast solar wind and slip into the quiet of space. Yet, beneath its simplicity lay the weight of decades of secrets buried beneath oceans and fears locked in silence. The chamber smelled of old paper, warmed electronics, and the faint tang of damp stone. Eleanor Vance sat cross-legged on the metal bench, a porcelain cup of tea resting untouched at her side. Her pen tapped softly against the leather notebook balanced on her knee, a rhythmic counterpoint to the subtle crackle of the power systems. She glanced up intermittently, her sharp eyes reflecting the otherworldly light from the sky, calculating solar flux and particle velocity with practiced precision. The aurora was more than a beautiful anomaly. It was the herald of the solar event they had awaited, the catalyst that would carry their message. At the far end of Flight Lieutenant Thomas Reed moved with deliberate care, running his hands over the array of instruments and wiring. His uniform jacket hung neatly on a nearby hook, the brass buttons gleaming faintly despite the dimness. He muttered under his breath, a dark humor threading through his voice as he recited system checks. "If this lot holds together, we'll be lucky to get a reply before tea time," he said, half smiling, but with eyes that betrayed the gravity of their task. The wind gusting outside rattled the old lattice window, carrying the distant call of seabirds and the salt tang of the North Sea. Miriam Kendrick, seated near a dusty archive cabinet, traced her fingers over the spines of bound reports and faded photographs. The quiet weight of history pressed against her palms, each document a fragment of the story they now sought to bring into the light. She breathed deeply, the scent of aged paper mingling with the cool stone air, and allowed herself a brief moment of stillness before returning her gaze to the central console. The moment was near, the culmination of years spent piecing together a silent puzzle no one wanted solved. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky that seemed to pulse with life. The aurora's green shimmer deepened, wrapping the hills in a spectral glow that made the surrounding landscape feel both ancient and fragile. The stone walls of the chamber absorbed the light, casting shadows that danced with the flickers of the equipment. The silence between the team members was not empty, but filled with unspoken resolve and the quiet hum of possibility. Alistair moved to the telescopic array positioned just inside the chamber's curved wall. The decommissioned radio telescope, now repurposed for their signal, lay dormant but ready. His fingers adjusted the alignment, calibrating the final angles with care. The dial's needle quivered slightly under his touch, as though alive with anticipation. He paused, breath steady, and allowed himself to remember the field in the Cotswolds, where 35 years before a pale light had darkened the night sky and altered the course of his life. Eleanor rose at that moment, crossing the floor with a quiet grace, her steps muffled by the worn rug beneath. She leaned over the console, eyes scanning the solar weather feed on the screen. "The events within 30 minutes, she said softly, voice steady, though her fingers twitched with the familiar anxiety of waiting. "Plasma density is rising faster than predicted. This could amplify the signal's reach." Reed joined them, arms crossed, his gaze flicking between the instruments and the window, where the aurora continued its slow, hypnotic dance. "We're ready to launch on your mark," he said to Alistair, his tone low but unwavering. "If there's a response, we'll know before the day ends. If not..." He let the thought trail off, the implication hanging in the charged air. Miriam approached quietly, carrying a small leather-bound journal. She set it on the console beside the signal generator, the worn cover faded with age. "For luck," she said with a faint smile. "A fragment of the past, a reminder of why we do this." The journal had belonged to Arthur Hayes, the retired radar operator who had finally broken decades of silence. It was their tether to truth amid uncertainty. The team gathered close, their faces illuminated by the soft green glow from outside and the steady light of the consoles. Alistair nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture. He pressed a sequence of keys, and the transmission began to pulse into life, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. The chamber filled with the quiet buzz of electricity, the steady flow of data streaming outward into the solar. wind. Eleanor tapped her pen against her notebook, her eyes never leaving the monitors tracking particle flow and signal strength. The aurora intensified, its waves rippling like silk across the sky, as if in silent response. The charged air prickled against their skin, a subtle but undeniable reminder that they were on the threshold of something vast and unfathomable. Reed monitored the systems, voice calm but clipped. Signal strength holding steady, no interference beyond background noise. His fingers hovered above the emergency cutoff switch, a guardian ready but reluctant to intervene. All systems nominal, were sailing into quiet waters now. The hum of the equipment settled into a steady cadence, a lullaby for the impossible journey they had set in motion. Miriam's gaze drifted to the journal again, her fingers brushing the page edge with reverence. The weight of history pressed softly upon them, a reminder that the past and present were intertwined threads leading to this fragile moment. Outside, the aurora's light shifted, pale bands curling like smoke across the blackening sky. The green glow seeped through the window, washing the chamber in a spectral light that blurred edges and softened shadows. The air smelled faintly of ozone and the distant sea, cool and alive. Alistair's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the signals read out. Each pulse was a question cast into the void, a deliberate act of reaching beyond the known. He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back, the familiar rhythm helping to steady his racing thoughts. The silence between pulses was as telling as the signals themselves, a testament to patience and hope. Eleanor finally broke the stillness. Solar flare is building. We might get a burst any moment now. It could amplify our transmission or drown it out. She drained the last of her tea, setting the cup carefully aside. Either way, we'll know soon enough. Reed nodded. Whatever happens, we stand ready. This is what we trained for, what we've all waited years to do. No turning back. His voice held a rare softness, a quiet admission of the enormity of their undertaking. Miriam exhaled, steadying herself against the stone wall. The archives said this cycle would be the one. The energy aligns once every 11 years. The connection is not coincidental. Her eyes gleamed with the certainty of long study. It's time. A sudden pulse of static crackled briefly through the speakers, then settled into silence. The room held its collective breath. The faintest tremor passed through the stone beneath their feet, as if the earth itself listened alongside them. Alistair approached the console again, fingers poised over the controls. We send the final sequence now, the question. His voice was calm, resonant with the gravity of the moment. Ready? One by one, the team nodded, eyes shining with quiet resolve. The signal shifted, the rhythm altering subtly, a complex pattern woven into the solar wind. It was no longer just a message, but an offering, a deliberate invitation to the ancient intelligence lurking beneath the waves. The chamber seemed to pulse with the energy of that unseen conversation, a fragile bridge between worlds. Outside, the aurora flared brighter, tendrils of green and violet swirling in impossible patterns. The charged air hummed softly, alive with the promise and the peril of the unknown. Time stretched, the seconds folding into hours, each moment a prayer cast into the cosmic deep. As the final pulse faded, Alistair exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting just enough to reveal the thin thread of hope beneath. Eleanor tapped her pen once more, a subtle rhythm echoing the fading signal. Reed's gaze remained fixed on the instruments, vigilant and patient. Miriam closed the journal, cradling it as if it were a fragile heart. The chamber settled into a profound stillness, the kind that follows a question too vast to answer. Outside, the sky began to pale as dawn edged toward day, the aurora retreating like a whispered secret. The team remained poised on the cusp of a new era, waiting for the silence to speak back. The chamber lay swathed in shadow, the low hum of the old telescope filling the space with a subtle vibration that seemed to seep into the bones. Alistair stood by the control panel, his fingers lightly brushing the worn surface, the texture of years-old paint and chipped metal grounding him in the moment. A thin haze of dust caught the intermittent glow of the instrument's lights, motes drifting lazily in the air, undisturbed. Outside, the distant storm clouds over the Peak District muttered softly, the faint scent of damp stone and wet heather permeating the air. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the monitors, her brow furrowed as streams of data scrolled in steady columns. The cold light from the screens cast a pale glow on her face, highlighting the fine lines of concentration etched around her eyes. Every so often her fingers would tap a measured rhythm against the edge of her notebook, a quiet metronome to the tension that throbbed beneath the room's surface. The mechanical click of the relays behind the console punctuated the silence, a reminder of the fragile dance between human will and machine precision. Reed's hands hovered over the control switches, ready but unmoving. His uniform, impeccable even in the dim light, seemed an extension of himself, precise, assured, disciplined. The faint scent of leather from his boots mingled with the faint metallic tang of the equipment. His eyes, dark and steady, surveyed the steel framework of the telescope, the great parabolic dish looming like a silent guardian beyond the structure's glass walls. He exhaled slowly, the sound measured and deliberate, an anchor against the rising tide of anticipation. Miriam sat slightly apart, clutching the leather-bound journal to her chest, as though it were a talisman. The book's spine creaked softly as she shifted, the fragile pages whispering secrets of half-forgotten days. Her eyes glistened faintly in the low light, reflecting not just the history contained within the tome, but a deep well of hope and uncertainty. The smell of old paper mingled with the earthy aroma from outside, a tactile connection to the past that had led them here. Alistair's voice broke the stillness, low and steady. This is it. We've synchronized perfectly with the predicted peak of the solar event. The flare's intensity is within the expected parameters. No interference, no anomalies. His words were calm, almost scholarly, but beneath the cool veneer was the barely contained weight of decades. Read, when you're ready. The pilot's fingers trembled imperceptibly as he moved toward the main console. His gloved hand reached out, and with a soft, resolute motion, he pressed the activation button. Instantly, a deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards and mingling with the distant rumble of the night outside. The telescope awakened, its great dish beginning a slow, deliberate pivot, aligning with an invisible coordinate beneath the North Sea's restless surface. The screens flickered as the signal began to pulse, simple, rhythmic bursts of pure mathematics, a language distilled to its essence. Binary sequences, prime numbers, Fibonacci spirals, patterns meant to reach beyond language, beyond culture. Into the realm of pure understanding, the sound was delicate, precise, a digital heartbeat sent through the ether. Eleanor leaned closer, her breath fogging the cold glass of her spectacles, eyes tracing the repeating patterns with reverence. Outside, the aurora shimmered faintly, green and violet ribbons curling and twisting against the ink-black sky. The natural light show seemed almost a benediction, a cosmic accompaniment to their fragile attempt at contact. The air was heavy with the scent of rain yet to fall, the quiet promise of the dawn just beyond the horizon. Time stretched taut in the chamber. Every second a measured step toward an unknown future. For the first 10 minutes, the pulse repeated unceasingly. The monitors registered the outgoing transmission with perfect clarity, the data flowing clean and unbroken. The room filled with the soft mechanical chorus of cooling fans and the low drone of the telescope's motors. It was a sound simultaneously mundane and magnificent, the intersection of human curiosity and the vast, unknowable deep. Then the silence began. No response, no flicker on the radar, no shift in the data streams. The monitors remained blank, save for the echo of their own signal. The weight of waiting settled in, an invisible pressure that pressed against the skin and settled deep within the chest. Eleanor's pen ceased its tapping, the rhythm broken like a heartbeat stilled. Reed's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed, a wave of frustration held carefully in check. Alistair paced slowly, the familiar scrape of his worn corduroy jacket against the floorboards a soft counterpoint to the hum. Each step measured, deliberate, mind turning over the equations and probabilities that had led them here. His gaze drifted to the leather-bound journal in Miriam's hands, the words within a testament to decades of silence and secrecy. He drew a slow breath, the scent of old paper mingling with the faint electronic ozone from the equipment. Miriam met his eyes, her expression a mixture of hope and resignation. "They're out there," she whispered, voice low, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. "They've always been watching." Outside, a sudden gust rattled the glass panes, carrying in the distant cry of an owl and the fresh tang of impending rain. The telescope's dish creaked slightly in its mount, a reminder of the physical presence anchoring this intangible endeavor. The quiet pulse continued, undeterred, a steady beacon cast into the abyss. An hour passed. The chamber's shadows deepened as the first pale light of dawn bled into the sky, washing away the aurora's fading hues. The team remained motionless, caught in a liminal space between past and future, certainty and doubt. Eleanor exhaled slowly, breaking the silence. "We can't give up yet," she said, voice steady despite the fatigue lining her words. "Signal strength is optimal, conditions perfect." Reed nodded, fingers resting lightly on the console's edge. "Whatever's out there is patient, so are we." His humor, dry and subdued, was a tether in the growing tension, a reminder of their shared resolve. Alistair stopped pacing, returning to stand beside Eleanor. His eyes glanced over the data again, searching for any anomaly, any hint of a change. The numbers told him nothing new. Still, his heart quickened in the quiet hope that the next moment might bring the impossible. Miriam gently closed the journal, her hands steady. 50 years ago, Arthur Hayes waited in silence. So can we. Her voice held a strength born of decades of quiet suffering. And finally, release. The hum of the telescope softened as the cycle repeated, the pulse unwavering. Outside, the first tentative birdsong stirred the dawn, a natural rhythm to accompany their vigil. The chamber felt suspended, a fragile bubble against the vastness beyond. Alistair's gaze drifted upward, to the small window near the ceiling where the sky was paling, the storm clouds retreating to reveal a fragile promise of light. The quiet signal continued, a question cast into the void. And still, the silence answered. The tension lingered, a breath held between worlds, as the team prepared to wait for whatever came next. The thin glow of dawn had barely begun to touch the horizon, when the first flicker appeared on Eleanor's monitor, subtle but unmistakable. Alistair was the first to notice. His pacing halted mid-step, the worn corduroy jacket rustling softly in the still air of the observatory. The room, usually humming with the steady pulse of the transmission, grew suddenly taut, the faint blue light from the screens casting long shadows across Miriam's leather-bound journal. Eleanor tapped her pen against the corner of the notebook, a habit born of years spent decoding patterns. This time, though, the tapping stuttered and slowed. The new signal wasn't random noise. It was a response. A series of shapes, unlike anything recorded before, emerged in a slow, deliberate pattern, a triangle, pointed and precise, moving rapidly across the digital map of the sky. Reed's dark eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he leaned closer to the sonar display. "That's no usual UAP," he muttered, voice low and steady, despite the rising tension. "It's moving fast. And it's not heading to a fault line, it's heading right for us." The air inside the glass-walled observatory seemed to thicken, heavy with anticipation. Outside, the North Sea whispered against the cliffs, the cold breath of the early morning wind threading through the thin cracks of the window panes. The greenish hue of the fading aurora cast an eerie light, making the vast shadow of the approaching object all the more surreal. Miriam closed her journal gently, her fingers lingering on the worn cover as if seeking strength from the decades of secrets bound within. "They're here," she whispered, voice barely above the hum of the electronics. "They've always been watching, and now they have come." Alistair's eyes were fixed on the external cameras mounted on the telescope array. Through the thick glass, a shape began to materialize against the shifting sky. A vast, silent triangle, enormous and impossibly still. The craft's edges were sharp but softened by the diffused aurora, casting a shadow that swallowed the telescope's massive dish hole. Reed exhaled slowly, his usually sharp features softened by a mixture of awe and pragmatic disbelief. "Bloody hell," he said quietly, "it's real, it's here." The room held its breath as the craft came to a gentle, deliberate stop directly overhead. The only sound was the low whine of the equipment, synchronized and steady, as if the observatory itself was holding vigil along with the team. Eleanor's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to log every nuance, every pulse of the incoming signal. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and wet stone through the open vent near the floor. The cold bit at their skin, grounding the surreal moment in the tangible reality of the English coast. Alistair's pacing resumed, slower now, more purposeful. His mind churned through decades of research and speculation, each step a quiet meditation on the fragile line between fear and understanding. Miriam's eyes never left the journal, as if the weight of history pressed upon her. "Arthur waited 50 years, she said softly, speaking more to herself than anyone else. "We can wait a while longer." The triangular craft began to emit a faint glow, subtle pulses of light rippling across its surface, synchronized with the steady digital heartbeat emanating from the telescope below. Eleanor's screen displayed the coded response in real time, an intricate dance of mathematical shapes and symbols that seemed to affirm recognition, a silent dialogue across the gulf of space and time. Reed's dry humor surfaced, despite the gravity of the moment. "Well, I suppose we'd better make ourselves presentable then." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a clean handkerchief, folding it with a practiced air of ritual. Alistair nodded curtly, his gaze unwavering from the windows. "This is no longer a question of proving they exist. It is a matter of what comes next." The silent triangle hovered, perfectly balanced against the cold green sky, holding its position with a grace that defied human engineering. The sun's first pale rays began to push back the aurora, revealing the craft's subtle textures, smooth, almost organic, yet unmistakably constructed. Eleanor adjusted the telescope's signal frequency in response, her fingers steady despite the tremor of excitement beneath. The response was growing clearer, less cryptic, an invitation perhaps, or a greeting encoded in the universal language of numbers and patterns. Miriam stepped to the window, the leather journal tucked under her arm, and pressed her palm against the chilled glass. The shadow of the craft was immense, dwarfing the landscape, yet it felt less like a threat and more like a solemn sentinel, a guardian of secrets long hidden beneath the waves. Alistair's voice broke the reverent silence. We are no longer merely observers. We are participants in a dialogue that began long before us. Reed's eyes flicked from the telescope to the monitors, then back again. I wonder if they understand the weight of what they've just done. To reveal themselves here, now. The observatory filled with the low hum of synchronized equipment, the pulse of the transmitted and received signals weaving a tapestry of connection. Outside, the sea continued its eternal dance, indifferent yet inexorably linked to the moment unfolding on the cliff's edge. Eleanor's hand found Miriam's briefly, a quiet gesture of solidarity and shared hope. Whatever happens, we are witnesses, and that must count for something. The triangle's lights shifted in a slow cascade, casting refracted glimmers across the room. The team watched in quiet reverence as the silent craft maintained its vigil, a bridge between ancient intelligence and the fragile hope of human understanding. As the first full light of day spilled over the horizon, the triangular silhouette lingered, immense and enigmatic against the awakening sky. The team remained rooted in their vigil, time stretching and folding in the stillness, caught between the silence of the past and the promise of what was to come. The pulse began softly, a gentle throb like the beating of a distant heart beneath the fabric of the night. The vast triangular shape overhead seemed to breathe in luminescent waves, its edges shimmering with a silken iridescence that diffused into the cold air. Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the console, her fingers moving in rapid, precise bursts across the keyboard, capturing every nuance of the incoming light. The aurora's fading glow mingled with the silent spectacle above, pale greens and pinks blending with the craft's radiant dance. In the cramped observatory room, the hum of old electronics filled the silence, punctuated only by the soft scrape of Miriam's notebook opening and the quiet tap of Reed's boots against the cold floor. Alistair stood near the window, his worn corduroy jacket a dim silhouette against the vast tableau outdoors. The triangular craft's pulses unfurled in complex streams of light, arrays of flashes, flickers, and pauses that suggested intention, pattern, design. It was as if the night itself were speaking a language ancient and vast. Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration as she traced the sequence, her breath shallow but steady. The pattern was mathematical, intricate beyond expectation, weaving prime numbers and fractal geometries into a tapestry of light. It's confirming our signal, she whispered, voice taut with disbelief. Not just confirmation, it's responding with new information, an invitation maybe, a greeting. Her pen tapped nervously on the edge of her notebook, a rhythmic punctuation to the vast stillness. Miriam's eyes gleamed with a mixture of reverence and quiet triumph. They're answering, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the soft crackle of the aged radio equipment. Her fingers traced the leather-bound journal, The worn pages beneath her touch, heavy with decades of secrets, finally unspooling into the present. This is the moment the past has been waiting for, a bridge between silence and understanding. Reed shifted his weight, gaze locked on the holographic projection of the craft's pulse. It's enormous, he murmured, voice low but steady, silent as the grave, but this light, it's alive. It's deliberate. He wiped a hand across his stubbled chin, the muscles in his jaw moving with a tension born of years spent balancing skepticism with moments like this, when the impossible seemed suddenly palpable. Gods, he added softly, a dark humor lacing the word. Alistair's footsteps echoed faintly as he paced the length of the room, each stride measured, deliberate. The worn fabric of his corduroy jacket rustled in the silent air. We're witnessing something beyond any terrestrial scope, he said, voice calm but charged. His eyes caught the subtle flicker of the radar screens, the quiet language of numbers and beams that had been his compass for so long. Now that compass spun toward an unknown north. This is not merely contact, it's recognition. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath. The cold, salt air carried the faint scent of seaweed and damp stone, mingling with the hum of the observatory's machinery. The triangular craft pulsed again, a sequence of bursts so brilliant they momentarily painted the room in stark white light. The shadows retreated, revealing the worn faces around the table, illuminated now by the glow of an encounter that had defied time and expectation. Eleanor's fingers flew over the keyboard, passing each segment of the light code with a clarity that transcended the chaos of the moment. They embedded a sort of hello, a universal greeting, she said, voice trembling with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Then, a series of prime sequences. It's not just communication. It's a signature of intelligence that's understood mathematics in a way that predates human knowledge. She paused, eyes scanning the data with taut fascination. This is a dialogue, not just a beacon. Miriam closed her eyes briefly, the weight of 50 years of secrecy lifting in the quiet embrace of this revelation. For so long, we've been the only ones listening, she said, voice a soft murmur. Now, they listened back. Her fingers clasped tightly around the journal, its leather cover warm under the fluorescent lighting. This changes everything. Reed's voice was steady, but the humor had faded. We're standing on the edge of something immense. The ocean out there, what's beneath it, has waited patiently for this moment. His gaze flicked toward the horizon where the faintest glow of dawn threatened the blackness. It's not just the sky that watches us. The hum of the machinery shifted subtly as the data streams intensified. Alistair's gaze locked on the console, mind threading through decades of suppressed knowledge and the fragile hope of this moment. This response, he said, voice low and deliberate, it confirms what we always suspected. These are watchers, guardians of a terrestrial intelligence far older than humanity itself. They've waited, studied, and now perhaps they're ready to engage. A sudden flicker on the radar caught Eleanor's attention. The pulses coalesced into a sequence, the triangular craft's outline now traced in scintillating points of light, moving with an uncanny grace directly overhead. The synchronized glow seemed to breathe with the observatory's electronic heart, a delicate, intricate dance choreographed across space and time. "Look at this," Eleanor whispered, voice tight with wonder. "A response layered on top of our signal, a code within a code." Miriam leaned forward, her hands folding over one another as her eyes drank in the display. "It's a message of patience," she said softly. a reminder of things long hidden beneath waves and stone. The layers of silence are finally lifting. The journal on the table seemed to pulse with unspoken stories, the weight of untold histories folding into the present. Reed exhaled slowly, the cold air of the observatory biting at his skin. "There's a kind of terrifying beauty here," he said. "To know that we've been observed all this time, and that this intelligence waits for the right moment to reveal itself." His voice carried a note of respect, tempered with the dark humor that had always been his shield against the unknown. "We're not alone, but we're not the newcomers either." Alistair's footsteps slowed as he returned to Eleanor's side. Their eyes met briefly, sharing the gravity and the fragile hope that now threaded their thoughts. "You've done well," he said quietly. "This is the beginning of a dialogue, a first step." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "But we must tread carefully. The world is not yet ready for this truth." Outside, a distant rumble broke the hush. The faint sound of sirens rolled across the coastal landscape, weaving through the night like restless shadows. The steady thrum of helicopter rotors sliced the silence, mechanical and insistent. Eleanor's gaze flicked toward the window, tension tightening her chest. "They're coming," she said, voice barely audible. Miriam's face tightened, the years of concealment carving lines of resolve and worry. "Sterling," she said solemnly, the name carrying the weight of decades. "He knows already, and he's bringing everything with him." Her hand closed over the journal, knuckles pale. "They won't let this moment stand unchallenged." Reed's jaw clenched, the weight of his uniform's immaculate fabric a silent reminder of duty and the limits of loyalty. "We need to move fast," he said, voice low but urgent. "This encounter can't be interrupted. Not now." His dark eyes scanned the room, seeking reassurance, and finding it in the shared determination around him. Alistair nodded, the worn corduroy jacket folding into the quiet resolve of the man who had carried this burden for so long. "We hold the line," he said, "for truth, for understanding." His gaze lifted to the silent giant above, the triangular craft still pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. "This signal? It's the quiet voice of a new era." Eleanor returned to the console, fingers flying to preserve every flicker, every coded burst of light. The room seemed to hum with electricity, a fragile nexus of hope and fear, history and revelation. The aurora faded completely now, leaving only the cold black sea and the luminous presence above, a sentinel in the dark. Outside, the first beams of government vehicles cut through the early dawn mist, their engines low and menacing. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, a reminder that the fragile silence was ending. The team exchanged glances, wordless acknowledgments of the peril ahead and the profound moment they had seized. Miriam's voice broke the silence, steady but filled with emotion. "We carried their message, and now we carry theirs." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "The past is no longer a shadow. It is a light." Reed moved to the door, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. "We need to be ready," he said. "The next phase begins, and it won't wait for us to be prepared." Alistair's gaze lingered on the craft's silent pulse, the steady rhythm that had spoken across decades and oceans. "Then we meet it on our own terms," he said softly. "We face this quiet signal and the questions it brings." The observatory lights flickered as the first government convoy arrived, the distant helicopters casting long, spinning shadows over the coastal rocks. The triangular craft hovered, a monumental presence against the awakening sky, its pulses a silent, inscrutable dialogue. Eleanor glanced toward the window one last time, the coded light still tracing its ancient pattern across the dark. "Hello," she whispered, voice trembling as the world shifted beneath their feet. "We hear you?" Silence settled briefly, profound and heavy, before the craft responded. Another burst of brilliant light, intricate and alive, filling the night with the quiet promise of a new beginning. The siren's chorus grew, but above it all, the signal pulsed on. The low rumble of diesel engines broke the stillness as a convoy of black Land Rovers wound their way along the narrow lane that led to the observatory. The sky was a dull canvas of clouds, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and sea salt. The path was bordered by gnarled oak trees, their ancient limbs casting long, skeletal shadows in the fading light. Inside the lead vehicle, Sir Malcolm Sterling sat rigidly, his hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes fixed on the silhouette of the radio telescope just visible beyond the ridge. A thin drizzle began, settling on the polished glass of the vehicles as the convoy advanced. The windshield wipers swept in measured rhythm, a quiet percussion against the soft patter of rain. Sterling's breath fogged the glass briefly before clearing, his expression unreadable but taut with restrained tension. His mind churned over the decades of decisions, the weight of secrecy pressing like a physical presence. This was the moment to assert control, to reimpose order on a chaos he had long feared. The convoy came to a halt on the gravel forecourt. The crunch of tires on stone echoed sharply in the still air. Sterling stepped out, the sharp click of his leather shoes on wet gravel marking his approach toward the observatory's entrance. His immaculate suit, dark and perfectly tailored, absorbed the muted light, a stark contrast to the weathered stone building looming ahead. The scent of wet stone and old metal lingered around the structure, mingling with the faint hum of electrical equipment inside. Within the observatory, Alistair Finch stood by the vast control panel, eyes glued to the screens that flickered with coded streams of light from the triangular craft hovering above the sea. He wore his habitual corduroy jacket, frayed at the cuffs and shoulders, a silent testament to years spent in quiet pursuit of truths. His gaze was steady but weary, a man carrying the burden of long-suppressed knowledge. When the door creaked open, he turned slowly, sensing the arrival of an old adversary. Sterling entered with measured calm, his voice low but firm as he addressed Finch. "Dr. Finch, I trust you understand the gravity of this situation." His tone lacked accusation, instead carrying the weight of years spent managing a delicate balance. The room hummed with tension, punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of Eleanor Vance's pen against her notebook as she recorded the unfolding dialogue. Alistair met Sterling's gaze evenly, his voice steady. "Sir Malcolm, I do, but I believe that balance has long since tipped. Suppression is no longer an option. This," he gestured subtly toward the glowing screens, "this is the reality we face. We must engage, not conceal." The words hung in the humid air, heavy with implication. Eleanor's fingers paused mid-tap, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Sterling's face tightened, a flicker of something resembling doubt breaking through his meticulously maintained composure. Engagement? With what exactly? An intelligence older than humanity itself emerging from the depths? Our policies have preserved societal order for nearly 6 decades. His voice was calm, yet beneath it lay a tremor of fear, fear of the unknown unraveling everything he had protected. Alistair stepped closer to the console, fingers hovering over the controls that translated the craft's signals into discernible patterns. Order built on a mission is fragile. The signals, they're not random. They're a message, a language. We've observed patterns that span decades, intersections of tectonic stress and electromagnetic anomalies. This intelligence monitors our planet's health, not from hostility, but from necessity. His eyes shone with a quiet conviction, a blend of hope and caution. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sharp tang of impending rain. The observatory's old windows rattled slightly in their frames, as if the building itself strained to contain the moment's weight. Eleanor moved to the central console, her voice measured as she added, "We've recorded the sequence thrice now, each time more complex. The craft responds to our attempts. This is dialogue, not mere observation." Her fingers danced over the keyboard, the gentle clacking underscoring her words. Sterling's gaze flicked to the glowing triangular form visible through the rain-speckled window. A pale light pulsed rhythmically from the craft, casting angular shadows across the interior. And what of the risk, the panic, the collapse of the narratives we've constructed? I have devoted my life to shielding the public from precisely this kind of disruption. His voice carried a note of weary resolve, a man wrestling with the consequences of his own legacy. Miriam Kendrick, seated quietly against the wall with a worn, leather-bound archive at her side, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but carried the weight of decades. The truth has been held in darkness for 50 years. We carried the burden of silence, but that silence has not prevented sightings, leaks, or worse, the slow erosion of trust. Revelation is inevitable. We can choose the form it takes. Her eyes were steady, reflecting the dim light like polished stone. Reed stood by the door, arms crossed, a figure of practical authority. We have an opportunity here, not just to learn, but to build a new framework, to prepare rather than react. I respect your decades of service, Sterling, but this moment demands adaptability, not rigidity. His tone was firm, grounded in experience, and tempered with a hint of frustration. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Sterling's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, he seemed to retreat inward, wrestling the storm of his own convictions. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft whir of equipment and the distant, rhythmic tapping of rain against the roof. Then, very slowly, he nodded, the slightest inclination of his head signaling a crack in his armor. Perhaps some truths are too old to remain buried. His voice was quieter now, more reflective than confrontational. Suddenly, the craft emitted a brilliant flash of light, flooding the observatory with a pale, iridescent glow that spilled over the walls and faces within. The light lingered, shimmering like liquid silver, then faded as quickly as it had appeared. The screens blinked, registering the final sequence of coded signals before the craft vanished beyond the storm-laden horizon. A profound silence settled, an ending and a beginning entwined in the same breath. Outside, the rain ceased as abruptly as it had started. The wind stilled, leaving only the faint, salty scent of the sea mingling with the earthy musk of wet stone. The observatory, bathed in the afterglow of the encounter, stood as a solitary sentinel against the vast, shifting tapestry of night. Within its walls, the people who had dared to listen exchanged glances, the enormity of what had just transpired settling upon them like a shared secret. Sterling's eyes remained fixed on the empty sky beyond the telescope's gaping dish. "This changes everything," he murmured almost to himself. The weight of 6 decades of concealment felt suddenly fragile in the face of that luminous silence. He turned to Finch, voice steady, but tinged with newfound uncertainty. "What now?" Alistair stepped forward, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "Now we begin. Together." His eyes drifted back to the darkened screen where the data still awaited interpretation. A language, centuries in the making, spoken softly through light and shadow. The future, once shrouded in doubt, now shimmered with possibility. Eleanor resumed her place at the console, fingers poised to decode the lingering echoes of the message. Reed secured the observatory's doors against the approaching night, a silent guardian. Miriam opened her archive, fingers tracing the faded pages of records long hidden. Outside, the world held its breath, poised on the cusp of revelation and renewal. The quiet signal had been received, and everything had changed. The night had not yet fully surrendered to morning when the last of the observers departed. They went quietly in ones and twos, pulling coats tighter against the October chill, their phones still glowing with photographs of the sky. The craft was gone. The sky above the telescope was empty and dark, scattered with the ordinary stars of an English autumn. But the world was not the same as it had been an hour before. Alistair Finch stood at the edge of the telescope's concrete apron, his hands in his pockets, watching the last car disappear down the valley road. He was aware of Sterling somewhere behind him, a presence as heavy and cold as the stone walls of the old observatory building. He did not turn around. Eleanor appeared at his shoulder. She had been inside, capturing the last of the data, saving everything to 3 separate drives with the methodical efficiency that had always been her greatest gift. She handed him a flask of tea, and he accepted it without looking at her. They stood together in the dark, drinking. "How many witnesses?" Finch asked at last. 14 confirmed, Eleanor said. "Probably more who haven't come forward yet. 3 of them have already posted on social media. The photographs are not great quality, but they're real. The craft is visible. It's already being shared." She paused. "It's over, Alistair. The containment is over." He nodded slowly. He had known it would come to this. He had planned for it, in a way. The choice of the telescope, the timing, the location that was accessible enough for curious locals, but remote enough that the response would be manageable. He had not planned it consciously, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he had understood that the truth needed witnesses. Reed came out of the observatory building, pulling on his jacket. He looked at them both, then at the empty sky, then back at them. "Sterling's on the phone," he said. "He sounds like a man who has just watched his life's work dissolve." He said it without satisfaction, without cruelty. It was simply an observation. "He'll want to manage it," Eleanor said. "He'll try," Reed agreed, "but he's 50 years too late." Finch turned at last and looked back at the observatory. Through the glass of the control room window he could see Sterling's silhouette, the phone pressed to his ear, his posture rigid with the effort of control. He felt, unexpectedly, a wave of something that was not quite pity and not quite sympathy, but something in between. Sterling had spent 60 years being afraid. That was a long time to be afraid. He walked back inside. Sterling ended his call as Finch entered. The 2 men looked at each other across the cluttered room, across the decades, across the gulf of everything that had happened. "It's done," Finch said simply. Sterling's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you've started." "I have every idea," Finch said. "I've spent 2 years thinking about nothing else." He sat down in one of the old chairs, the leather cracked and cold. The question now is not whether this becomes known, it will. The question is how we manage the transition, and for that, I need your help. Sterling stared at him. The silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of old electronics and the distant sound of wind across the telescope dish. My help, Sterling repeated, as if the word were in a foreign language. You've spent 60 years managing secrets, Finch said. Now I need you to help manage a revelation. The skills are not so different. He waited. The intelligence is not hostile. It has never been hostile. Your fear was real, but it was misplaced. The public can handle this, Sterling. They are more resilient than you think. Sterling sat down heavily in the chair opposite. He looked for the first time like an old man. The immaculate suit, the perfect posture, the controlled voice. All of it seemed to have deflated slightly like a balloon losing air. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. I saw it in 1965, he said quietly. I was 23 years old. I was on the Suffolk coast doing a routine inspection of the radar station, and I saw it come out of the sea. He paused. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen and the most terrifying, because I understood in that moment that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. He looked up. I spent the next 60 years trying to make it wrong again. Finch said nothing. He let the silence hold the confession. I was wrong, Sterling said, not about the danger of the knowledge. I was wrong about the danger of the truth. He straightened slightly. What do you need from me? Outside, Eleanor and Reed were standing at the telescope, looking up at the stars. The night was very quiet. Somewhere in the dark valley below, a fox called once and was silent. The great dish of the telescope pointed at the sky, patient and still. The data was saved. The witnesses were gone. The photographs were already spreading across the internet, small and blurry and undeniable. The world was changing slowly, the way all real changes happen, not with a bang, but with a quiet, irreversible shift in the foundations. Finch and Sterling talked through the night. By the time the dawn came, they had the outline of a plan. It was not a perfect plan. It was a human plan, which meant it was imperfect and provisional and subject to revision. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Finch had learned, were the most important thing. The sun came up over the Peak District hills, pale and gold, and the world looked exactly as it always had. The same hills, the same sky, the same cold English morning. But beneath the surface, in the deep places of the sea and the deep places of the human mind, something had shifted. Something had opened. Finch stepped outside and breathed the cold air. Eleanor and Reed were still there, standing by the telescope. He walked over to them. Well, Reed said. Well, Finch agreed. Eleanor was looking at her phone. It's already on the BBC website, she said. They're calling it Unexplained Aerial Phenomena over the Peak District. They have 3 photographs. She showed them the screen. The photographs were blurry and imprecise, taken on mobile phones in the dark, but the triangular shape was visible, the pulse of light unmistakable. And in the background of one photograph, the great dish of the decommissioned telescope pointing at the sky. Finch looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he handed the phone back to Eleanor. Let's go inside, he said. There's a lot of work to do. They went back into the observatory, the 3 of them, and the door closed behind them, and the work began. The days that followed were unlike anything Finch had experienced. The world did not end. The public did not panic. What happened instead was something stranger and more interesting. People began to think. The photographs spread quickly. Within 24 hours, they were on every major news website in the world. Within 48 hours, there were questions in Parliament. Within a week, the government had issued a statement acknowledging that unexplained aerial phenomena had been observed over the Peak District and that an investigation was underway. It was not a confession, it was not a revelation. It was a careful, measured acknowledgement that something had happened and that the government was taking it seriously. It was, in the language of official communication,